I thought painting my wife's office as a birthday surprise would earn me a loving smile. Instead, when I took down a heavy framed painting, I found a small hole in the drywall. Pressing it popped open a hidden drawer. Inside were 3 passports with fake names, and what I found underneath them terrified me to my core. My name is Howard Simmons. I am 70 years old. I am a retired chief engineer, and until that Tuesday, I believed I had a perfectly normal family. Before I continue this story, let me know what city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever discovered a secret that changed your life forever. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon in our sprawling suburban home just outside of Atlanta. My wife Naomi was supposedly away on a 3-day religious retreat in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We had been married for 40 years. I thought I knew every detail of her life, every habit, and every preference. Since I retired, I enjoyed working on projects around the house. Naomi had mentioned wanting her home office painted a soft cream color. I decided to tackle the project while she was gone so she could come home to a beautiful surprise. I laid down the drop cloths and began moving the furniture. There was a large, heavy landscape painting hanging behind her desk. She bought it years ago at an estate sale and always insisted on dusting it herself. When I carefully lifted the heavy wooden frame off the wall, I noticed something unusual. My engineering background trained me to spot structural anomalies. There was a small, perfectly square seam cut into the drywall, completely concealed by the painting. In the center of the seam was a tiny indentation. I pressed my thumb against it. I heard a soft mechanical click. A small, spring-loaded compartment popped out from the wall. My initial thought was that Naomi had a hidden safe for her grandmother's jewelry or maybe some emergency cash she kept for a rainy day. I pulled the drawer completely open. The reality was far more sinister than a secret stash of money. Inside the dark space lay 3 crisp navy blue passports. I picked them up with hands stained with white primer. I opened the first one. The photograph was of Naomi, but the name printed next to it was completely foreign to me. It read, Valerie Thompson. I opened the second passport. The face of my 42-year-old son, Aaron, stared back at me. The name read Marcus Thorne. My heart began to beat against my ribs like a trapped bird. I opened the third and final passport. It showed the face of my 38-year-old daughter-in-law, Megan. She was a white woman from a family that claimed to have old money but who constantly relied on my wallet to maintain their wealthy image. Her fake passport identified her as Chloe Thorne. I stood in the center of the room, completely frozen. Why would my wife, my son, and my daughter-in-law have federal identification under assumed names? The betrayal began to seep into my bones. I had spent 40 years working at an aerospace plant, enduring double shifts and intense corporate pressure, so my African-American son would never have to struggle the way I did growing up. I had quietly bailed out Aaron when his string of flashy tech businesses failed. I had paid for his extravagant wedding because Megan claimed her family wealth was tied up in a complicated trust that she could not access. I gave them everything I had. I drove a 10-year-old truck so they could drive luxury sedans. I smiled politely when Megan made subtle, passive-aggressive comments about my simple habits and my working-class roots. I endured all her quiet insults for the sake of family harmony. And now the people I sacrificed my entire life for were staring back at me from fraudulent documents. I looked around the room, the walls half-painted in the soft cream color Naomi had requested. I thought about the thousands of mornings I woke up early to provide for this household. I thought about how Naomi would kiss my cheek and pack my lunch. Was every kiss a calculation? Was every loving word just a strategy to keep me working while they plotted my downfall? The sheer scale of the deception was dizzying. They had gone to the trouble of securing illegal passports. That meant they were planning a permanent escape. They were going to take my wealth and disappear, leaving me behind as a discarded shell. I placed the passports on the desk. My hands were shaking, but my mind was shifting from pure shock into sharp, analytical clarity. I reached back into the dark compartment to see what else my wife was hiding. My fingers brushed against thick manila envelopes. I pulled them out and placed them under the bright office lights. The first envelope felt heavy in my hands. I opened it and pulled out a stack of legal papers. They were life insurance documents. They were not old policies from years ago. They were freshly finalized, stamped, and dated just 2 weeks prior. I read the coverage amount and the numbers blurred before my eyes. There were 2 policies totaling $5 million on my life. I flipped to the last page to see the designated recipient. It was not my wife of 40 years. The sole beneficiary of my death was Megan, the same woman who complained that my homemade barbecue smelled too strong and who always rolled her eyes when I spoke about my childhood. She stood to inherit $5 million the moment my heart stopped beating. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. My breathing grew shallow, but I forced myself to open the second envelope. It was a medical file. It bore the logo of a prestigious private clinic in the city. The document was a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. It was pre-signed by a doctor I had never met in my entire life. I read the diagnosis printed in bold black letters. The document declared that Howard Simmons suffers from advanced severe dementia. It stated that I was profoundly incompetent, incapable of managing my own finances, and a danger to myself. The final paragraph recommended immediate permanent institutionalization in a secure facility. I read the doctor's notes detailing my supposed symptoms. The report claimed I frequently wandered out of the house, forgot my own name, and became violent with my family. It was a complete work of fiction, a malicious narrative designed to strip away my human rights. They knew that as an older African-American man, once I was placed into the system under a dementia diagnosis, it would be nearly impossible for me to fight my way out. No one would believe me. Any protests I made would simply be recorded as symptoms of my disease. The cruelty of their plan was absolute. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. I was a structural engineer. I played chess every weekend. I managed my own complex investment portfolios without a single error. I was in perfect mental health. Yet this official document legally erased my mind. I realized in that horrifying moment that they were not just planning to steal my money. They were planning to completely erase my existence. If they locked me in an asylum, they could trigger a living payout, or simply wait for me to die while they fled the country using their new passports. They had planned my legal and physical death with terrifying precision. I carefully folded the documents and placed them back into the envelopes, putting everything exactly as I had found it. The silence of my large house suddenly felt like a trap. I was a man standing inside a cage built by the people I loved most. The sharp metallic clack of the front deadbolt unlocking echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. I froze completely. My heart slammed against my ribs with terrifying force. The distinct jingling of my wife's keychain followed immediately in the foyer. Naomi had returned from her supposed religious retreat exactly 2 days early. I had exactly 60 seconds before she crossed the entryway and reached the hallway leading to her office. Adrenaline flooded my veins instantly. My decades of engineering background kicked in and overrode my panic with pure, calculated action. I grabbed the thick manila envelopes containing my death sentence and the 3 fraudulent passports. I shoved them aggressively back into the dark recess of the drywall. I pushed the spring-loaded panel hard against the framework. It snapped shut with a soft click and blended seamlessly back into the wall. I turned my attention to the heavy landscape painting resting on the canvas drop cloth. The cream-colored primer on the wall was still wet and highly prone to smudging. I grabbed the thick wooden frame with both hands. My 70-year-old shoulders strained violently against the immense weight of the solid oak. I lifted it upward while desperately avoiding the freshly painted surfaces below. My breathing grew ragged in the silent room. The sharp clicks of her designer high heels echoed on the hardwood floors of the living room. She was moving fast. I aligned the hanging wire with the heavy wall hook and let the painting drop into place. I quickly wiped my hands on my paint-splattered jeans to remove any drywall dust. I kicked the canvas drop cloth slightly to make it look like I had been working on the floorboards for the past hour. I had 5 seconds left before she reached the door. I dropped to my knees beside a plastic tray of primer and fumbled intentionally with a wet paint roller. I needed to mask my racing heart and erratic breathing. I needed to become exactly what my family believed me to be. I adopted the persona of a slow, tired old man who was simply trying to do a nice chore for his wife. Naomi stepped into the doorway and stopped. She was wearing a tailored navy blazer and immaculate, expensive makeup. She looked absolutely nothing like a woman returning from a spiritual retreat in the rugged mountains. The scent of an expensive airport perfume clung heavily to her clothes. Her eyes did not immediately search the room for me. The very first thing she did was dart her dark gaze directly past my head to the landscape painting on the wall. She meticulously scanned the edges of the heavy wooden frame. I watched her pupils trace the borders, checking for any sign of structural disturbance. I remained on the floor, pretending to struggle with the roller handle. I let out a loud, exaggerated groan and wiped my forehead with the back of my hand. Only then did she finally look down at me. Her rigid, tense posture instantly melted into a sickeningly sweet stance. She gasped loudly and asked what on earth I was doing on the floor. I forced a warm, loving smile and told her I wanted to surprise her for her birthday. I explained I was painting her office the exact cream color she had always wanted. She stepped carefully around the drop cloths, acting deeply touched by my romantic gesture. But I was no longer the blind husband I had been an hour ago. I watched her entire performance with razor-sharp clarity. Every gentle touch she placed on my shoulder and every soft word of gratitude was completely hollow. The horrifying reality washed over me like freezing water. My 40-year marriage was a meticulously crafted illusion. The woman standing above me was a dangerous stranger wearing my wife's face. All those decades of shared meals and all those quiet evenings holding hands on the porch had been a calculated fraud. She had been studying me for years, waiting for the perfect moment to harvest my life and my wealth. I leaned heavily against the wall and complained about my joints aching from the manual labor. I needed her to feel completely superior and entirely in control. I needed her to believe that her old husband was just a harmless fool playing with wet paint. Naomi crouched down to my eye level so we were face to face. The sweet smile remained plastered on her features, but the tone of her voice suddenly sharpened into an aggressive interrogation. She asked me very slowly and deliberately if I had moved any of her paperwork while I was clearing the room. She pointed a manicured finger toward the desk, asking if I had opened any drawers or touched her private files. I could see the cold calculation burning behind her dark eyes. She was probing for a leak in her security. I knew that one wrong word would sign my death warrant. I feigned mild confusion. I blinked several times and rubbed my temples as if trying to grasp a complicated question. I asked her why I would ever care about her boring tax documents when I was just trying to figure out how to edge the ceiling without falling off a ladder. I deliberately mispronounced the name of the primer brand. I complained that my memory was getting terrible these days and told her I could not even remember where I put the lid to the paint can. I fed her the exact narrative she desperately wanted to hear. I gave her a live demonstration of the cognitive decline she needed to justify her fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. I saw the immediate wave of relief wash over her features. The tension in her shoulders vanished completely. She let out a soft, condescending laugh and patted my cheek like a child. She told me not to worry about the messy room and suggested I take a long nap because I was clearly overexerting my fragile mind. She stood up and announced she was going to take a hot shower to wash off the travel fatigue. She walked down the hallway, leaving me alone on the paint-splattered drop cloth. The facade worked perfectly. I had successfully fooled a master manipulator. But as the bathroom door clicked shut down the hall, the sheer gravity of my situation settled heavily onto my chest. I was completely trapped. I was sleeping under the exact same roof with a woman actively plotting my demise. I had no safe haven to retreat to. I could not go to my son Aaron because his face was on the fake passport. I could not turn to my daughter-in-law Megan because she was the sole beneficiary of my murder. I was entirely alone in a house filled with predators. If I made one wrong move, they would execute their legal trap and lock me in a psychiatric asylum forever. I dipped the roller back into the paint pan. I knew exactly what I had to do. I had to play their twisted game far better than they ever could. Sunday evening arrived with the heavy scent of roasted chicken and collard greens drifting through the house. The doorbell rang sharply at exactly 6 o'clock. I opened the door to find my son Aaron and his wife Megan standing on the porch. Aaron wore a tailored Italian suit he absolutely could not afford on his failing company salary. Megan stood beside him holding a bottle of cheap wine but carrying a designer leather handbag that cost more than my first truck. She brushed past me without a formal greeting and handed her coat directly to Naomi. Naomi played the role of the doting mother, perfectly kissing Aaron on the cheek and complimenting Megan on her expensive outfit. Megan had always treated our home like a low-budget restaurant where she was forced to dine out of pure charity. She took her seat at the dining table and immediately launched into her usual toxic routine. She inspected the silver cutlery with a subtle sneer, making a quiet, passive-aggressive comment about how my old-fashioned working-class habits were quaint but ultimately exhausting to be around. She asked if I had properly washed my hands after messing around with the paint in the office, using a tone usually reserved for a disobedient child. I forced a polite smile and poured the ice water. She watched me closely and loudly asked if I was sure I had not forgotten how to pour a simple glass without spilling on the hardwood floor. She pointed out a non-existent water ring on the table and sighed heavily. She turned to Aaron and mentioned that my memory was clearly slipping because I supposedly forgot to offer her a proper greeting at the front door. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was laying the psychological groundwork for her narrative. She needed to establish my mental decline in front of witnesses to build a consistent history of incompetence. She looked at me with cold eyes and told Naomi that it must be so incredibly difficult dealing with an elderly man who is rapidly losing touch with modern reality. Her racially tinged microaggressions were not new, but tonight they carried a sharp, lethal edge. She was not just insulting my age or my African-American heritage. She was actively building a legal case against my sanity. The meal progressed with the tense atmosphere of a courtroom interrogation. Naomi brought the main courses to the table and took her seat next to Aaron. I deliberately positioned myself at the head of the table where I could observe all three of them simultaneously. Midway through the dinner, Megan asked me to pass the salt. I reached toward the center of the table where the silver salt shaker always sat. It was completely gone. I scanned the immediate area around the serving dishes but came up empty. Megan let out a sharp, exaggerated laugh. She reached down into her lap and produced the salt shaker, holding it up like a hunting trophy. She loudly proclaimed that I was entirely losing my mind. She told Aaron and Naomi that I had literally just handed her the salt 2 minutes ago and had instantly forgotten my own actions. I had done no such thing. I watched her slip the shaker off the table when she thought I was looking at the oven. It was classic gaslighting. I instantly connected this aggressive psychological manipulation directly to the forged psychiatric evaluation resting inside the hidden wall compartment. They were actively constructing my dementia diagnosis right at the dinner table. I bowed my head and offered a meek apology. I acted highly embarrassed and mumbled that my brain was just feeling a little foggy tonight. I needed them to feel completely victorious in their deception. I looked across the roasted chicken directly at my son. Aaron sat there chewing his food in silent agreement with his wife. He did not defend me. He did not correct her obvious lie. A deep, suffocating sorrow settled heavily in my chest. I looked at the expensive gold watch shining on his wrist. I remembered the exact day I wired $70,000 to his business account to save his second tech startup from total bankruptcy. I remembered paying off his corporate leases and covering the payroll for his employees so he would not face federal fraud charges. I had drained a massive portion of my early retirement funds to ensure my African-American son would succeed in a corporate world built against him. I had handed him every financial advantage I never had growing up in poverty. I even paid for the down payment on their luxury suburban home because Megan refused to live in a diverse neighborhood. Now he was using those very advantages to finance his own luxury while quietly watching his white wife orchestrate my institutionalization. The food tasted like ash in my mouth, but I chewed slowly and remained perfectly compliant. Before they arrived, I had taken a critical precautionary measure. I had purchased a small voice-activated digital recorder using cash from a local electronics store so there would be no paper trail on my credit cards. I had securely taped the device to the underside of the heavy oak dining table right near Aaron and Megan's chairs. I reached down under the pretext of adjusting my cloth napkin and slid the small switch into the active position. A tiny red light blinked once in the darkness, confirming it was capturing every single word. I excused myself from the table, claiming I needed to fetch the dessert from the kitchen. I walked slowly, dragging my feet slightly to sell the image of a frail old man. I stopped just outside the dining room door, remaining completely hidden in the shadowed hallway. I held my breath and listened carefully. Megan wasted no time. Her voice drifted clearly through the open doorway. She laughed and told Aaron that my brain was practically turning to mush. She joked that I would soon need round-the-clock supervision because I was becoming a complete financial liability to their lifestyle. I waited for my son to scold her. I waited for him to show 1 ounce of loyalty to the father who had given him everything. Instead, Aaron chuckled softly. He agreed with her completely. He casually mentioned that he had already looked into a high-security mental facility on the rural edge of the state. He told Naomi they just needed me to sign the final property transfer deeds next week before they officially locked me away for my own safety. He joked that the facility had a nice enclosed garden where I could wander around and forget my own name in peace. Hearing my son actively plan my confinement erased any lingering doubt in my mind. Aaron was not a victim of Megan's manipulation. He was a fully willing and eager participant in the conspiracy to end my life. I stood in the dark hallway listening to my family laugh over my impending destruction. The pain of his betrayal was sharp, but it quickly hardened into a cold, calculated resolve. I wiped my hands on my slacks, turned around and walked back into the dining room carrying the dessert. I served them warm pie with a gentle smile, knowing that the recorder under the table was currently capturing the exact federal evidence needed to put them all in prison. The crisp morning air on Monday provided a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of my house. I drove my 10-year-old truck to the main branch of my bank in downtown Atlanta, gripping the worn steering wheel with a quiet and burning determination. I had been a premium client at this specific institution for over 30 years. I knew the tellers by their first names, and they knew my exact financial preferences. I needed to verify the security of my retirement portfolios before making my next strategic move against my family. I walked through the heavy glass doors and headed straight for the private client services desk. The branch manager, Richard, was a man in his late 50s who usually greeted me with a firm handshake and a warm, familiar smile. Today, his reaction to my presence was entirely different. When he saw me approaching, his face visibly paled. He quickly closed a file folder on his desk and stood up with an awkward and tense posture. I took the plush leather seat across from him and simply asked for a printed overview of my primary investment accounts and my liquid savings. Richard swallowed hard and actively avoided making direct eye contact with me. He began to stammer something about standard bank procedures and mandatory compliance holds. I cut him off politely but firmly and demanded a straight factual answer. Richard wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and lowered his voice to a hushed whisper. He informed me that he could not provide a standard withdrawal slip or authorize any transfers for me today. He stated that my primary retirement funds were currently completely frozen. I sat perfectly still as he explained that a massive commercial collateral hold had been placed on my accounts. According to the bank system, 80% of my entire lifetime savings was currently locked down to secure an active corporate credit line. The sheer magnitude of the theft hit me like a physical blow to the chest, but I kept my facial expression completely neutral. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic to the nervous manager. I looked Richard directly in the eyes and requested physical copies of the commercial hold documentation immediately. He hesitated for a brief moment, but my unwavering stare left him absolutely no room for debate. He nervously clicked his mouse and printed a thick stack of legal papers. He handed them across the desktop with a trembling hand. I put on my reading glasses and examined the documents with the meticulous scrutiny of a chief engineer inspecting a compromised structural blueprint. The paperwork detailed a massive commercial loan issued to Aaron's latest technology firm. The business had been hemorrhaging money for months, and Aaron had successfully leveraged my retirement portfolios to secure a massive cash bailout for his failing company. I scanned the signature lines at the very bottom of the lengthy contract. There in black ink was my exact signature. It was a flawless, meticulous forgery. Someone had perfectly replicated the distinct loops and sharp angles of my handwriting. I turned the page to look at the authentication section. My blood ran completely cold. Stamped directly beside my forged signature was a dark blue official notary seal. I read the name printed on the legal stamp. It belonged to Naomi. My wife had used her state-authorized notary credentials to legally validate a completely fraudulent signature. She had legally sworn under penalty of perjury that I was present and actively consenting to the destruction of my own financial future. The betrayal was layered with terrifying precision. Aaron was the architect of the theft, but Naomi was the legal enforcer. They had colluded to drain my accounts dry and transfer the capital directly into Aaron's failing enterprise. Megan's family was likely living off the surplus while my bank accounts sat paralyzed. I kept reading through the dense legal jargon. The collateral agreement stipulated that if the commercial loan defaulted, the bank had the absolute right to seize my retirement funds to cover the debt. Aaron had essentially written a massive check using my blood and sweat as currency. If his company went under, I would be left completely destitute. I realized that my wife and my son had worked in perfect synchronization to lock me out of my own money. They had executed a flawless financial coup right under my nose. I folded the documents neatly and placed them into my leather briefcase. I thanked Richard for his time and stood up to leave, but the manager was not finished speaking. Richard cleared his throat and gestured for me to sit back down in the leather chair. He leaned across the desk and lowered his voice even further, looking around to ensure no other bank employees were listening to our conversation. He informed me that Aaron had visited the branch just last week. My son had scheduled a private meeting with the bank executives to discuss the future management of my accounts. Richard explained that Aaron had requested the paperwork necessary to assume full legal power of attorney over my entire estate. My son had provided the bank with a compelling and sorrowful story about my rapidly declining mental health. He told Richard that I was suffering from severe early-stage dementia and could no longer be trusted to make sound financial decisions. Aaron had claimed he was stepping in out of pure familial love to protect my hard-earned assets from my own fading mind. The bank was currently reviewing the request and waiting for the final medical documentation to process the total transfer of power. I absorbed this horrifying information with a chilling clarity. The trap they had built was legally binding and structurally perfect. If I walked into the local police station right now and claimed my family was stealing from me, the authorities would simply look at the immaculate paperwork. They would see an authorized commercial loan, a legally notarized signature, and a deeply concerned son trying to protect his confused father. When the police questioned Naomi, she would show them the psychiatric evaluation hidden in the wall. The local authorities would instantly dismiss my claims as the paranoid delusions of a sick old man. Any protest I made would simply accelerate their timeline to lock me away in a secure facility. I could not rely on standard law enforcement to save me. I was facing a coordinated syndicate of highly educated predators using the legal system as a weapon against an elderly African-American man. I thanked Richard for his transparency and promised him I would seek the proper medical guidance for my supposed condition. I walked out of the bank into the bright Atlanta sunlight carrying the fraudulent documents in my briefcase. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. I needed a completely different tier of protection. I needed someone who operated outside the local jurisdiction and who understood the precise mechanics of federal financial warfare. I needed a ruthless ally. I merged my 10-year-old truck onto the busy interstate, leaving the quiet deception of my suburban neighborhood far behind. I drove directly toward the towering glass and steel skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta. I did not waste a single second dwelling on the heartbreak of my ruined marriage or my son's ultimate betrayal. I needed a relentless shark, and I knew exactly where to find one. Jonathan was a 50-year-old federal financial crimes attorney with a terrifying reputation for absolute ruthlessness. I had crossed paths with him briefly over a decade ago during a highly contentious corporate patent dispute at my old engineering firm. He was an incredibly expensive legal assassin who dismantled white-collar syndicates for a living. I parked in the secured underground garage of his sleek high-rise building and took the private elevator directly up to his penthouse suite. Jonathan sat behind a massive slab of polished black marble, looking exactly as sharp and predatory as I remembered. He did not offer any empty pleasantries or fake sympathetic smiles. He simply gestured for me to take a heavy leather seat and asked what kind of war I was preparing to wage. I opened my briefcase and systematically laid out my arsenal on his desk. I placed the forged commercial loan contracts and the notarized collateral documents right in front of him. I pulled out my phone and displayed the clear photographs I had taken of the 3 fake passports, the freshly minted life insurance policies, and the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. Finally, I placed the small digital voice recorder on the cold marble and pressed play. We sat in absolute silence as the recording of Aaron and Megan casually plotting my permanent institutionalization filled the pristine office. Jonathan listened with cold, unblinking eyes. He did not express any outrage or shock. He simply reached out, turned off the recorder, and asked me for Megan's exact maiden name. Jonathan turned his attention to his multi-monitor workstation and began typing with aggressive precision. He completely bypassed standard public records and logged directly into highly classified federal financial databases. I sat quietly in the leather chair, dripping with a mixture of tense anticipation and quiet fury. Within 15 minutes, Jonathan had completely unraveled the pristine, aristocratic illusion of my daughter-in-law. Megan had always bragged extensively about her elite family lineage and treated my working-class African-American roots with thinly veiled disgust. She paraded her designer handbags around my house and drove luxury European vehicles, acting as though she had descended from untouchable old money. Jonathan turned a wide monitor toward me and shattered her arrogant narrative entirely. Her elite white family was currently drowning in massive, suffocating debt. Her parents had secretly filed for bankruptcy twice in the past 12 years. Their sprawling colonial estate in the wealthy suburbs was leveraged to the absolute limit and facing imminent foreclosure by the end of the month. Jonathan pulled up a complex web of recent wire transfers originating directly from Aaron's failing technology firm. The massive corporate loan secured by my stolen retirement funds was not actually being used to save Aaron's legitimate business operations. Aaron was systematically funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars through untraceable shell accounts directly into the pockets of Megan's parents. My own son was draining my lifetime of hard-earned wealth to secretly pay off the massive debts of a family that viewed me as entirely inferior. They were actively using an elderly black man as an unlimited credit line to artificially maintain their fake aristocratic lifestyle. The racial dynamics of their coordinated theft added a sickening layer of profound cruelty to the betrayal. Aaron was apparently so desperate to buy the ongoing approval of his white in-laws that he was willingly sacrificing his own father to the financial slaughterhouse. Jonathan printed the detailed wire transfer logs and stacked them neatly beside my forged bank documents. He explained in a cold, clinical tone that Aaron and Megan were not just committing simple local theft. They were engaging in highly coordinated interstate wire fraud and felony criminal conspiracy. Every single financial transfer they made across state lines to Megan's parents escalated their crimes from a civil dispute into a severe federal offense carrying decades of mandatory prison time. I looked at the undeniable mountain of evidence resting on the marble desk and felt a surge of adrenaline. I told Jonathan I wanted to drive straight back to my house and confront all of them immediately. I wanted to kick Naomi out of my home and freeze every single bank account before they could steal another dime. Jonathan leaned forward and stopped me with a look of absolute terrifying authority. He warned me that a direct, aggressive confrontation today would result in my immediate and permanent destruction. He pointed sharply at the photograph of the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation on my phone screen. He explained that Naomi currently held a legally binding and medically certified document declaring me a severe danger to myself. If I walked through my front door and started shouting about criminal conspiracies and stolen millions, my wife would simply retreat and dial emergency services. She would hand the responding police officers the forged medical file and calmly tell them I was having a severe dementia-induced psychotic break. The local authorities would instantly secure me in restraints and lock me inside a state psychiatric ward before sunset. Once I was legally committed by the state, Aaron would quickly execute his pending power of attorney and drain the remaining 20% of my financial assets. Jonathan told me the only way to truly destroy them was to build an airtight federal indictment that bypassed local law enforcement entirely. To achieve that guaranteed destruction, I had to provide the FBI with irrefutable proof of a continuous and ongoing criminal enterprise. Jonathan gave me a deeply chilling mandate that froze the blood in my veins. I had to return to my house and walk willingly back into their deadly trap. I had to let Aaron continue moving the stolen funds across state lines to build the federal case. I had to let Naomi continue acting as my loving caretaker while she plotted my end. Jonathan warned me that they would inevitably escalate their methods to artificially accelerate my physical and mental decline. I had to let my own family continue poisoning me both financially and literally. I had to endure their toxic dinners, their fake smiles, and their dangerous physical interventions until the federal net was perfectly woven. I shook Jonathan's hand, accepting the terrifying psychological reality of my new existence. I walked out of the towering glass building and drove back to the suburbs, fully prepared to play the role of the dying prey. The morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains of our kitchen, casting long shadows across the polished granite countertops. I sat at the kitchen island reading the daily newspaper just as I had done every morning for the past 40 years. My hands held the paper steady, but every muscle in my body was coiled tight with anticipation. I was a man waiting for an executioner who was currently humming a cheerful tune by the coffee maker. Naomi walked over holding my daily plastic pill organizer and a steaming mug of black coffee. She placed the mug in front of me and popped open the Tuesday compartment of the organizer. She gently tipped the contents into her palm and extended her hand toward me. Her voice was dripping with fake marital devotion as she reminded me to take my blood pressure medication before I ate my breakfast. I looked down at her outstretched hand. I had taken the exact same brand of lisinopril for nearly a decade. I knew the precise weight, the chalky white texture, and the tiny alphanumeric manufacturer stamp engraved on the surface of the small round tablet. The pill resting in the center of her palm was wrong. The shape was a fraction of a millimeter too thick. The white coating had a slightly glossy sheen that my usual medication lacked. Most importantly, the distinct manufacturer stamp was entirely missing. The surface was completely blank. I raised my eyes and looked at my wife. She was smiling down at me, but her dark eyes were completely dead. They were fixated on my mouth with the cold, calculated intensity of a predator watching a trap spring shut. She was not just handing me my morning routine. She was actively monitoring my compliance. Jonathan had warned me that they would escalate their physical interventions to artificially accelerate my mental decline. The first strike was happening right now in my own kitchen over a cup of morning coffee. I smiled warmly and thanked her for always taking such good care of me. I reached out and took the blank white pill from her hand. I brought the mug of hot coffee to my lips and tossed the pill toward my mouth. I executed a flawless sleight of hand. I used a technique I had perfected decades ago when doing amateur magic tricks for Aaron when he was a little boy. I let the pill slide discreetly between my fingers and drop straight into the cuff of my long flannel sleeve. I took a large gulp of the hot coffee and swallowed audibly. I wiped my mouth with a napkin and patted my stomach. I watched the immediate physical relief wash over Naomi. Her shoulders dropped their rigid posture and her smile transformed from a tense grimace into an expression of genuine sinister satisfaction. She patted my shoulder affectionately and turned back to the stove to finish cooking my eggs. She firmly believed I had just ingested whatever chemical compound she had sourced to destroy my mind. I finished my breakfast and announced I was going to head out to the hardware store to buy some new tools for the garden. I walked to my truck and locked the doors before carefully retrieving the foreign pill from my sleeve. I slipped it into a small plastic Ziploc bag and placed it securely in my breast pocket. As I drove toward the city, my thoughts drifted to the deep intimacy of this specific betrayal. For our entire marriage, Naomi had been the undisputed manager of our household health. When I caught a severe bout of pneumonia 10 years ago, she stayed awake for 3 consecutive nights, placing cool rags on my feverish forehead and administering my antibiotics with flawless precision. She was the one who scheduled my dental cleanings, tracked my cholesterol, and organized my vitamin regimens. I had always viewed her medical diligence as the ultimate expression of her profound love for me. I had trusted her completely with my physical vulnerability. Now she was weaponizing that exact history of trust to dismantle my nervous system. She was using the sacred domain of her caretaking as a lethal weapon to feed me poison. The emotional pain was staggering, but I shoved it down and focused entirely on the logistics of my survival. I parked behind an unmarked concrete building in an industrial sector on the edge of the city. Jonathan had texted me the address of a highly discreet private toxicology laboratory frequently utilized by federal defense attorneys. I walked inside and handed the plastic bag to a technician waiting behind reinforced glass. I provided the specific client code Jonathan had assigned to my case. The technician did not ask for my name or any personal details. He simply took the pill, printed a barcode, and told me the expedited mass spectrometry results would be routed directly to my attorney within 3 hours. I left the sterile facility and spent the next few hours sitting alone in a crowded diner, drinking cheap coffee and mentally preparing myself for the horrors to come. My encrypted phone vibrated sharply in my pocket just before noon. It was a secure message from Jonathan containing the official toxicology report. I opened the PDF file and read the chemical breakdown. The blank white pill was not a standard cardiovascular medication. It was a highly concentrated black market compound composed primarily of a heavy-grade veterinary tranquilizer mixed with a synthetic neurotoxin. The medical notes attached by Jonathan's forensic expert detailed the exact physiological effects of human ingestion. The drug was specifically engineered to aggressively suppress the central nervous system. A single dose would induce extreme physical lethargy, slurred speech, and severe hand tremors. Prolonged daily usage would rapidly trigger acute short-term memory failure, crippling confusion, and highly realistic visual hallucinations. The chemical compound would literally melt my cognitive functions while leaving my vital organs pumping. I sat in the diner booth staring at the glowing screen in absolute horror. The forged psychiatric evaluation hidden in the wall was not merely a piece of paper, it was a theatrical script they had written for me, and these pills were the mechanism to force my body to perform the role. They were not passively waiting for me to get older. They were actively constructing my dementia from the inside out. If I had swallowed that pill this morning, my hands would be shaking violently by dinner. If I took them for an entire week, I would wander around my own house, unable to remember my name or recognize my surroundings. When Aaron finally brought the state medical authorities to the house to evaluate my competence, I would genuinely look, act, and speak like a man suffering from profound late-stage dementia. The legal paperwork would be instantly validated by my actual physical and mental collapse. The sheer evil of their strategy was breathtaking. They were going to trap me in a chemical prison inside my own skull before locking me in a physical asylum. I deleted the file from my phone and cleared the cache. I looked out the diner window at the bustling afternoon traffic. I understood the lethal countdown I was currently operating under. Naomi would be expecting to see the initial symptoms of the sedative taking effect by this evening. If I walked into the house looking sharp, focused, and energetic, she would immediately realize I had not swallowed the drug. She would pivot her strategy and find a new way to administer the poison, likely slipping it directly into my food or drinks where I could not isolate it. I had to protect my actual cognitive health by perfectly mimicking the physical destruction she expected to see. The game had officially shifted from quiet observation into active daily performance. I stood up from the diner booth and adjusted my posture. I let my shoulders slump forward and practiced introducing a slight involuntary tremor into my right hand. I walked out to my truck, knowing that when I returned home, I had to become the broken, deteriorating old man my wife and my son were so desperately trying to create. I parked the truck in the driveway and let my right hand tremble violently as I reached for the door handle. I shuffled into the house, dragging my feet and staring blankly at the hallway rug. Naomi greeted me with a sickeningly triumphant smile. I mumbled incoherently about losing my keys and told her I felt incredibly exhausted. She guided me to the recliner with fake sympathy and offered me a glass of water. I played the pathetic role flawlessly until the sun went down and she finally retreated to our master bedroom. I waited 2 full hours in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of her deep breathing. When I was absolutely certain she was asleep, I slipped out of my recliner and moved with silent precision. My engineering career had required me to design microcircuitry and run diagnostic optics through impossibly tight spaces. I retrieved a small black case from a false bottom in my toolbox in the garage. Jonathan had procured high-definition motion-activated micro-cameras that were no larger than a standard button. I moved into the kitchen and installed the first lens directly inside the ventilation grate of the microwave hood, offering a sweeping panoramic view of the entire kitchen island and dining area. I ran the hair-thin optical wire behind the cabinetry, sealing it flawlessly. I moved to the living room and embedded a second camera inside the hollow base of a decorative lamp Naomi had bought years ago. I synced both devices to an encrypted local network I had established exclusively on my secure laptop. I tested the feeds using my phone in the dark hallway, verifying the audio sync was flawless. The night vision resolution was incredibly sharp, capturing every square inch of the spaces where my family operated. I crept into the guest room, locked the door, and powered down for the night. I was no longer just a victim waiting in the dark. I had effectively turned my own house into a federal surveillance black site. The following evening, Naomi suggested I sleep in the downstairs guest room because my supposed nocturnal wandering was disrupting her rest. It was the perfect excuse. I shuffled into the spare room at 8 o'clock, locked the door, and immediately booted up my encrypted laptop. I plugged in my noise-canceling headphones and stared at the dark screen, waiting for the trap to spring. At exactly 10 o'clock, the digital motion sensor alert flashed a bright warning red across my screen. The kitchen camera feed flickered to life in crisp, high definition. The front door chimed softly, and Aaron walked into the kitchen, followed closely by Megan. Naomi greeted them with a hushed tone and poured them both glasses of expensive red wine. I watched the three of them gather around the granite kitchen island like a boardroom of corporate executives preparing a hostile takeover. Aaron unzipped his leather briefcase and pulled out the identical thick manila envelope I had discovered hidden inside the drywall 2 days ago. He spread the forged psychiatric evaluation across the countertop, smoothing out the creases with his palms. Megan leaned aggressively over the documents, tracing the fake doctor signature with her long, manicured fingernail. The audio feed was crystal clear, transmitting their whispered conspiracy directly into my ears. Aaron asked his mother if I had taken the modified medication that morning. Naomi laughed, a cold, sinister sound that made my stomach turn. She proudly confirmed that I had swallowed the pill without a single question. She boasted that my physical deterioration was already visible, claiming my hands were shaking, and my speech was slurred by dinner time. Megan took a sip of her wine and smiled grimly. She praised Naomi for her commitment to the role of the burdened caregiver. I watched my son slide a fresh stack of legal papers next to the medical evaluation. He pointed to the highlighted signature lines and explained that the bank was fully primed for his power of attorney request. They just needed my official dementia diagnosis filed with the county court to make the financial takeover legally bulletproof. The coordination between my wife, my son, and my daughter-in-law was terrifyingly efficient. They reviewed the fraudulent documents line by line, verifying dates and cross-checking the fake medical symptoms Naomi had logged in a separate notebook. I adjusted the audio gain on my laptop and hit the master record button. Every malicious word and every physical gesture was captured securely onto my encrypted hard drive. The conversation shifted from the psychiatric paperwork to their overall timeline, and the atmosphere grew noticeably tense. Megan slammed her crystal wine glass down on the granite counter with a sharp, aggressive clink. She complained bitterly that I was simply not declining fast enough for her liking. She stated that her parents were facing a brutal balloon payment on their luxury estate next month, and they needed massive capital immediately. She leaned aggressively across the kitchen island and demanded Aaron accelerate the process. She explicitly outlined the final phase of their criminal enterprise. She stated loudly and clearly that they needed to force me to sign over the deed to the coastal vacation property by this Friday. She insisted that the moment the ink was dry on that real estate transfer, they would physically drag me to the state asylum and check me in as a permanent ward of the state. Her voice dripped with raw venom as she detailed how my official institutionalization would perfectly trigger the living payout clause on the $5 million life insurance policy. Aaron nodded in total agreement and promised his wife he would bring the property deed tomorrow under the guise of standard tax paperwork. He assured her he would guide my trembling hand to sign it if he had to. Naomi chimed in, confirming she would double the dosage of the black market sedative tomorrow morning to ensure my brain was completely fried before Aaron arrived with the pen. I sat in the dark guest room staring at the glowing screen while a cold sweat formed on my brow. They had just laid out their entire premeditated fraud, property theft, and attempted murder scheme in high-definition audio and video. Megan had explicitly connected the forged psychiatric paperwork to the insurance payout and the real estate theft. I pressed the save icon and watched the progress bar secure the massive video file. I had just captured the undeniable, irrefutable federal evidence Jonathan needed to lock them away for decades. My heart hammered with a dark, triumphant rhythm. They wanted me to sign away my coastal sanctuary tomorrow. I decided I would give them exactly what they wanted, but the signature I provided would be the final nail in their federal coffin. The heavy brass mail slot on our front door clattered shut, echoing through the quiet foyer. I shuffled slowly toward the entryway, dragging my feet in the exact rhythm of a decaying man while Naomi watched me from the kitchen counter. I gathered the stack of envelopes and magazines from the hardwood floor. My hands shook slightly as part of my daily performance, but my mind remained incredibly sharp. I sifted through the junk mail and utility bills until a thick official envelope from the county tax assessor caught my attention. The return address indicated it was from the commercial real estate division. I slipped the envelope between two grocery store catalogs and carried the stack to my recliner in the living room. Naomi asked me if there was anything important in the daily delivery. I mumbled that it was just the usual garbage and let my chin rest on my chest as if the short walk had exhausted me entirely. I waited for her to turn on the vacuum cleaner before I carefully opened the county envelope. Inside was a finalized tax assessment bill for a massive commercial warehouse I owned on the south side of the city. The document officially notified me of a reassessment due to a recent and sudden change in ownership. According to the county records, I had legally transferred the entire commercial property to a newly formed holding company exactly 3 days ago. I stared at the bold black ink confirming the massive theft. Aaron and Megan were accelerating their timeline just as they had promised on the hidden camera recording. They were systematically stripping away my real estate portfolio piece by piece while I sat trapped in my own living room. I did not show a single ounce of panic. I quietly slipped my encrypted phone from my pocket and snapped high-resolution photographs of every single page of the tax document. I opened my secure messaging application and forwarded the images directly to Jonathan. I folded the tax bill and tucked it deep inside the lining of my leather recliner out of sight. I closed my eyes and waited for the legal assassin to analyze the new evidence of their escalating crimes. Jonathan replied less than an hour later with a secure encrypted phone call. I retreated to the guest bedroom and locked the door under the strict pretense of taking an afternoon nap. Jonathan skipped the pleasantries entirely. He instructed me to look at the second page of the digital file I had sent him. He directed my attention to the bottom right corner of the property transfer deed where the authorization signatures were finalized. My forged signature was there, but Naomi had not notarized this specific document. The dark blue official seal belonged to a man named Bradley Jenkins. Jonathan informed me that Bradley was Megan's younger brother. He was a 28-year-old licensed notary public working at a boutique real estate firm in the city. Aaron and Megan had actively recruited him into their criminal syndicate. Bradley was officially rubber-stamping my forged signatures to legally facilitate the transfer of my commercial real estate into the hands of a shell company controlled by his bankrupt parents. A wave of profound disgust washed over me. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and clenched my fists. I remembered the day Aaron married Megan. I remembered sitting at the reception while Bradley and the rest of Megan's elite white family looked at me with thinly veiled condescension. They treated me like a curious anomaly, an African-American man who had somehow stumbled into their pristine, aristocratic world. They boasted about their generational wealth and their prestigious family lineage while subtly mocking my calloused hands and my practical suits. Now the absolute hypocrisy of their existence was laid bare on official county documents. Their golden boy Bradley was actively committing severe felony fraud to steal an old black man's hard-earned wealth. They viewed my 40 years of grueling engineering work merely as a financial stepping stone to save their sinking ship. They were a family of well-dressed parasites feeding off my life force. The sheer racial and class arrogance required to execute this theft fueled a cold, relentless fire in my chest. They believed they were inherently entitled to my money simply because of who they were. I promised myself in that quiet room that I would strip them of every single illusion they held about their own superiority. Jonathan told me the notary fraud elevated the entire conspiracy. By involving Bradley, they had expanded the criminal enterprise and multiplied the wire fraud charges. The federal net was growing wider and heavier by the hour. Jonathan confirmed he was immediately adding the fraudulent tax documents and Bradley's notary records to the massive wire fraud dossier he was preparing for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every piece of paper they forged was another nail in their collective coffin. We had them dead to rights on paper. I hung up the secure line and felt a rare moment of dark triumph. The legal guillotine was almost perfectly assembled. I unlocked the guest room door and shuffled back into the hallway, practicing my manufactured tremors and vacant stares. Before I could reach the kitchen, Naomi intercepted me. She stepped out of her home office holding a glossy medical brochure and a small appointment card. She wore an expression of deep, exaggerated concern that made my stomach churn. She reached out and took my trembling hand, speaking in a slow, soothing voice designed for a toddler. She told me she had been noticing how confused and exhausted I had been lately. She claimed it was breaking her heart to see my brilliant mind slipping away so quickly. She patted my hand and announced she had taken the liberty of booking a specialist appointment for me tomorrow morning. She explained she had found a highly recommended private neurologist who could finally give us some answers and prescribe a proper treatment plan for my severe memory loss. I stared into my wife's calculating dark eyes. The blood rushed in my ears as I recognized the exact shape of the trap springing shut. This was not a routine medical checkup. This was the medical ambush they had plotted on the hidden camera. They needed the official dementia diagnosis filed with the county court to trigger the power of attorney and finalize my institutionalization. Naomi was leading me directly to the slaughterhouse with a sweet smile on her face. I nodded slowly and gave her a weak, confused smile, thanking her for always looking out for my best interests. I knew I had to walk willingly into that clinic tomorrow. I had to sit in front of their chosen doctor and play the role of a broken, mindless old man. I had to let them secure their fake medical paperwork so Jonathan could finalize the federal indictment. I shuffled back to my recliner and sat down in the quiet living room, mentally preparing myself for the ultimate performance of my life. The morning air was thick with unspoken tension as Naomi helped me into a heavy wool sweater. She treated me with the exaggerated patience one usually reserves for a confused toddler. I maintained my vacant stare, allowing her to guide me out of the house and into the passenger seat of her pristine luxury vehicle. We drove away from our familiar local hospital and headed deep into an affluent northern suburb. She pulled into the parking lot of a sleek glass building that looked more like a high-end corporate headquarters than a medical facility. The polished gold lettering on the stone retaining wall read, "Prestige Cognitive Care." Inside the waiting room smelled of fresh lavender and expensive leather furniture. A young woman at the front desk greeted Naomi warmly by her first name, proving this appointment had been meticulously prearranged long before today. 10 minutes later, we were escorted into a spotless examination room. The door opened, and a man barely in his early 30s confidently walked in. He wore a tailored custom suit under a pristine white lab coat and carried a digital tablet with a practiced air of absolute arrogance. He introduced himself as Dr. Gregory Hayes. I recognized his sharp features instantly from a framed photograph Megan had prominently displayed in her living room. He was her former university classmate, a wealthy fraternity alumni who frequently attended her high society social events and cocktail parties. He did not look at me as a living, breathing patient in need of care. He looked at me as a highly lucrative financial transaction. He offered Naomi a warm, familiar smile before turning a patronizing clinical gaze toward me. He spoke incredibly slowly, asking how I was feeling today in a mocking tone. The entire setup was a flawless theatrical production. My wife and my daughter-in-law had bypassed objective medical professionals entirely and hired a corrupted friend to forge my destruction. I sat quietly in the examination chair, preparing myself to face a man who was willing to sell my freedom for a favor. Dr. Hayes pulled a rolling examination stool directly in front of my chair and began his assessment. The cognitive test he administered was a blatant, horrifying mockery of standard medical protocol. He did not ask me standard orientation questions like the current year or the name of the president. Instead, he fired rapid, highly specific questions about complex financial dates and minor domestic events, deliberately interrupting me before I could even finish a sentence. He asked me to recall the exact sequence of numbers from a tax document I supposedly signed last month. When I intentionally paused and looked at Naomi with wide, frightened eyes, he immediately typed vigorously on his tablet, shaking his head in mock disappointment. He handed me a digital pen and asked me to draw the face of a clock showing 10 minutes past 11. I gripped the pen with a violent manufactured tremor. I purposefully drew the numbers clustered tightly together on one side of the circle and let the pen drop to the floor. Naomi placed a comforting hand on my shoulder and let out a dramatic, sorrowful sigh. Dr. Hayes nodded grimly and stated for the record that my spatial reasoning was severely degraded. He then pivoted to questions explicitly designed to establish emotional instability and paranoia. He asked if I ever felt irrationally angry at my loving family or if I harbored delusional thoughts about people stealing my money. I leaned forward and whispered that I could not trust my own memory anymore. I told him I felt like I was losing my mind and begged him to help me. I manufactured a single tear that rolled down my cheek. Naomi hugged me tightly, wiping the tear away while exchanging a victorious, knowing glance with the doctor right over my shoulder. Dr. Hayes finalized his digital notes and confidently announced his diagnosis. He stated that I was suffering from a rapid onset of advanced Lewy body dementia. He declared that my cognitive decline was entirely irreversible and that I required immediate placement in a secure full-time memory care facility for my own physical safety. He told Naomi he would have the official medical certification drafted and signed by the end of the day, giving Aaron the exact legal ammunition he needed to execute the ultimate power of attorney. They were completely convinced they had just permanently locked the cage door. What neither my treacherous wife nor her corrupted doctor realized was that I had not walked into this ambush alone. Earlier that morning, I had insisted that my physical weakness required the assistance of a professional medical transport driver to help me safely in and out of the vehicle. A quiet, heavily built man in a dark official uniform had driven us to the clinic and escorted me directly into the examination room. Naomi had ignored him completely, viewing him as a low-level service worker entirely beneath her elite notice. Dr. Hayes had not even bothered to ask him to wait outside the room, assuming the driver was just a mindless hired hand. The silent man standing attentively in the corner of the room was not a transport worker. He was a senior undercover inspector for the state medical board meticulously planted by my attorney Jonathan. Pinned to the lapel of his uniform was a high-definition microcamera and a continuous audio transmitter securely linked directly to Jonathan's federal evidence server. Every biased question, every manipulated test result, and the prearranged fraudulent diagnosis had been recorded with pristine clarity. As Dr. Hayes enthusiastically shook Naomi's hand and promised to fast-track the institutionalization paperwork, the inspector silently documented the exact moment a licensed medical professional committed felony healthcare fraud. Jonathan had explained to me last night that this specific recording would not only secure my absolute freedom, but it would completely obliterate the doctor's career. When the federal indictment finally came down, Dr. Hayes would be stripped of his medical license and face severe federal prison time for conspiring to falsely imprison an elderly African-American citizen for financial gain. The trap my family thought they were setting for me had become the very mechanism of their own destruction. The net had grown thick and unbreakable. I stood up slowly from the chair, leaning heavily on the undercover inspector's arm for support. I gave Dr. Hayes a weak, terrified smile, playing my part to the very bitter end. We walked out of the clinic and headed back to the car. My family believed they had just secured the final weapon to destroy my life, but in reality they had just handed the federal government the ultimate proof of their criminal syndicate. The weekend arrived with a heavy sense of impending violence. Despite securing the fraudulent medical diagnosis from their corrupted doctor, my son Aaron grew increasingly frustrated by the slow, bureaucratic wheels of the county court system. He needed raw cash immediately to appease his bankrupt in-laws, and the legal delay was making him reckless. He arrived at my house on Saturday morning carrying an expensive bag of imported artisanal coffee beans. He wore a forced smile and announced he wanted to treat his tired old father to a special morning brew. He claimed the rich roast would help clear my foggy mind. I sat in my usual leather recliner and watched him move around the kitchen island. My decades of engineering background taught me to constantly analyze sightlines and reflections in any given environment. From my seated position, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the stainless steel oven door, which acted as a dark mirror reflecting the countertop where my son prepared the drinks. I watched Aaron look over his shoulder to ensure I was staring blankly at the television. Satisfied that I was distracted, he pulled a small glass vial from the pocket of his tailored slacks. He unscrewed the cap and quickly tapped a fine white powder directly into my favorite ceramic mug. He stirred the dark liquid aggressively until the chemical compound completely dissolved into the hot coffee, leaving no trace of the poison. My own flesh and blood was physically lacing my morning drink with a toxic substance. The sheer audacity of his action paralyzed my heart for a brief second. He was no longer relying solely on Naomi to administer the dangerous black market sedatives hidden in my pill organizer. He was taking my destruction into his own hands to artificially accelerate my mental collapse. He wiped his hands on a kitchen towel and picked up the heavy mug. He walked into the living room and handed me the poisoned drink with a sickeningly sweet smile, telling me it was brewed exactly the way I liked it. I accepted the warm ceramic mug with two trembling hands, playing the role of the frail invalid to absolute perfection. I looked up at my son and offered him a deeply grateful smile, thanking him for taking time out of his busy weekend to care for his aging father. Aaron gave my shoulder a patronizing squeeze and turned his back to me to answer an incoming text message on his phone. He assumed I was just a helpless old man eager to drink whatever was handed to him. He completely underestimated my meticulous preparation. After consulting with Jonathan regarding their escalating chemical warfare, I had purchased a specialized medical concealment flask. It was a flat, heavy-duty silicone pouch, securely strapped directly to my right forearm beneath the thick fabric of my oversized cardigan. A discreet plastic tube ran perfectly down the inside of my sleeve, terminating just above my wrist. As soon as Aaron turned his attention to his phone screen, I moved with absolute precision. I uncapped the hidden nozzle with my thumb and tilted the heavy mug. I poured 90% of the scalding toxic liquid directly down the concealed tube into the silicone reservoir secured tightly against my arm. I felt the intense heat of the coffee radiate against my skin, but I did not flinch or make a single sound. I left only a few harmless drops of the dark roast at the very bottom of the cup. I quickly resealed the plastic nozzle and brought the nearly empty mug up to my lips. Aaron turned back around and pocketed his phone just as I pretended to take a massive gulp of the hot coffee. I let out a satisfied sigh and set the mug down heavily on the wooden side table. I praised the rich flavor of the artisanal beans and thanked him again for the generous treat. I did not have to wait long to execute the next phase of my performance. I let exactly 4 minutes pass before I initiated my physical deterioration. I let out a low, confused groan and reached up to massage my temples. I blinked rapidly and stared blankly at the television screen, acting as though the room was spinning violently out of control. I let my jaw go slack and slurred my words, asking Aaron why the lights in the living room were suddenly flickering so brightly. The high-grade black market sedative was supposed to induce immediate severe cognitive failure and acute lethargy. I gave them a flawless physical manifestation of a man whose central nervous system was actively shutting down. I let out a sharp gasp and allowed my eyes to roll back into my head. I intentionally slid off the edge of the leather recliner and crashed heavily onto the hardwood floor of the living room. I lay there completely motionless, keeping my breathing incredibly shallow. Naomi rushed out of the hallway, having heard the loud thud of my body hitting the floorboards. She immediately began shouting Aaron's name in a loud theatrical display of panic. I kept my eyes closed, but my hearing remained razor sharp. I expected them to immediately dial emergency services to maintain their cover as a caring family. Instead, an agonizing, chilling silence fell over the room. Aaron calmly instructed his mother to put her cell phone down on the table. He explicitly stated that they needed to wait exactly 5 minutes before calling the paramedics. He wanted to guarantee that the toxic compound had sufficient time to fully saturate my bloodstream and permanently damage my brain tissue. Naomi readily agreed, whispering that the hospital staff needed to witness a man in a state of absolute irreversible dementia to validate their legal paperwork. I lay paralyzed on the cold floor, listening to my wife and my son coldly calculate the exact timing of my brain death. They stood over my motionless body, watching the clock on the wall tick away the seconds. What my treacherous family did not realize was that the microscopic motion-activated camera hidden inside the decorative lamp was capturing their entire murderous delay. The high-definition lens recorded Aaron checking his luxury watch and physically stopping Naomi from dialing for help. The hidden microphone captured their whispered agreement to ensure the poison took full effect. They were actively demonstrating premeditated attempted murder and severe elder abuse on a secure federal server monitored by my attorney. When the 5 excruciating minutes finally passed, Aaron picked up his phone and dialed emergency services. He instantly transformed his voice into a masterclass of hysterical grief, crying to the dispatcher that his elderly father had just collapsed from a severe neurological episode. He begged the operator to send an ambulance immediately, playing the role of the devastated son flawlessly. The sirens began to wail in the distance, rushing toward my house to save a man who did not need saving. I remained perfectly still on the floor, securing the chemical evidence strapped safely to my forearm. The federal trap was now fully armed and ready to obliterate their lives. The blaring sirens faded into the sterile white noise of the emergency room as paramedics wheeled me through the sliding glass doors. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing shallow. A team of nurses immediately swarmed my gurney, attaching heart monitors and intravenous lines with practiced efficiency. I allowed my body to remain entirely limp, playing the role of an elderly man whose neurological functions had collapsed completely under the weight of severe dementia. The emergency room doctor shined a bright penlight into my pupils, asking me basic orientation questions. I stared right through him, offering only a faint, slurred groan. Aaron stood near the foot of the bed, giving a masterful performance of a devastated son holding back tears. He explained to the attending physician that I had been suffering from severe cognitive decline for weeks and had simply collapsed without warning in the living room. Naomi stood by his side, clutching her designer purse and nodding in solemn agreement with his fabricated medical history. The doctor documented my supposed condition with grim finality and ordered my immediate transfer to a private recovery suite on the 4th floor. Once the orderlies settled me into the pristine hospital bed, the real agenda of my treacherous family took over. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving the 3 of us alone in the quiet room. Aaron immediately dropped his grief-stricken facade. He checked his luxury watch and sharply told Naomi that they needed to secure the long-term admission paperwork before the hospital administration office closed for the weekend. Naomi agreed, completely adjusting her jacket with cold indifference. She leaned over my supposedly comatose body and checked my pulse, not out of concern, but to ensure I was adequately subdued by the toxic coffee. Satisfied with my vegetative state, she turned on her heel and walked out of the room. Aaron followed closely behind her, locking the door from the outside to ensure no medical staff interrupted their administrative theft. I laid perfectly still in the sterile hospital bed, listening to their footsteps fade down the corridor. I was now officially incapacitated on paper. The medical trap they designed was fully armed, but they had carelessly left me unguarded for the most critical hour of my life. Exactly 3 minutes after my family departed, the adjoining bathroom door slowly creaked open. Jonathan stepped out into the hospital room wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying a slim leather briefcase. My federal attorney had utilized his extensive hospital administration contacts to bypass security and wait silently for this precise window of opportunity. I opened my eyes and sat up immediately, tearing the heart monitor sensors off my chest to silence the rhythmic beeping. We did not waste a single second on pleasantries. I rolled up my heavy flannel sleeve and detached the silicone concealment flask strapped securely to my forearm. I handed the heavy pouch filled with the toxic artisanal coffee directly to Jonathan. He placed the chemical evidence into a tamper-proof forensic bag and slid it into his briefcase. That simple bag contained the physical proof of attempted murder needed to secure federal indictments against my own flesh and blood. Jonathan pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and placed a sleek tablet on the rolling tray table. The moment Aaron and Naomi officially filed my admission paperwork claiming I was medically incompetent, a pre-signed legal contingency clause was automatically activated. Jonathan tapped the tablet screen and initiated a flawless financial maneuver we had mapped out days ago. With my formal incapacitation registered in the hospital system, Jonathan executed his supreme authority as my predetermined legal proxy. He systematically transferred every single dollar of my remaining uncompromised wealth into a high-security, irrevocable trust. The receiving entity was a private charitable foundation I had secretly established entirely beyond the reach of probate court and completely immune to any power of attorney Aaron might wave around. I watched the progress bars on the tablet screen fill up rapidly. Millions of dollars vanished from my vulnerable personal accounts and locked safely into an impenetrable financial fortress. Jonathan finalized the digital transfers and handed me a physical confirmation receipt. The immense fortune Aaron and Megan had plotted to steal to save her bankrupt elite white family was now entirely gone. They had leveraged their entire future on a massive commercial loan backed by retirement funds that no longer existed in my name. The bank would soon realize the collateral was void, and Aaron's failing technology firm would face immediate catastrophic liquidation. I had successfully drained the very ocean they planned to swim in, leaving them to drown in their own debt. Jonathan packed his briefcase and nodded sharply. He slipped back into the bathroom just as the heavy lock on the main suite door clicked open. I threw myself violently backward onto the pillows and closed my eyes, recreating my comatose posture with a split second to spare. Aaron walked confidently back into the private suite, holding a thick clipboard filled with official hospital forms. Naomi trailed behind him, looking incredibly satisfied with her administrative progress. They stood at the foot of my bed, entirely unaware that they were now standing over an empty financial grave. Aaron flipped through the pages of the clipboard, muttering to Naomi about the specific clauses required for involuntary psychiatric commitment. He held the exact legal mechanism needed to lock me inside a state asylum permanently. He boasted quietly that the attending physician had already signed off on the transfer orders based on my dramatic physical collapse. He bragged that Megan was currently finalizing the intake procedures at a high-security rural facility under her fake identity to avoid any future audits. The institutionalization they had plotted on the hidden camera was literally unfolding right before my closed eyes. Aaron placed the clipboard on the side table and leaned aggressively over my face. He stared down at me with absolute contempt, whispering that my long, miserable reign over his life was finally coming to an end. He promised me that I would spend my final years staring at a padded wall while he lived in luxury on my dime. I maintained my shallow breathing and did not react to his sickening taunts. The irony of the situation burned fiercely in my chest. Aaron firmly believed he held the ultimate legal power over my physical body and my lifetime of wealth. He possessed complete confidence that his meticulously orchestrated fraud was bulletproof. He had absolutely no idea that the signature on his commercial loan was about to trigger a massive federal banking investigation. He had no clue that his white in-laws were about to face catastrophic financial ruin because the money he promised them had evaporated into a charitable trust. The stage was perfectly set for my horrific institutionalization. My family was preparing to load me into a transport vehicle and strip away my human rights forever. I lay silent and motionless in the sterile hospital bed, embracing the darkness. They thought they had finally defeated the foolish old black man who built their comfortable lives. They did not understand that I was now the invisible architect of their absolute destruction. The heavy hospital door swung open with a sharp swoosh that shattered the sterile silence of my recovery suite. I maintained my perfectly still posture, keeping my breathing shallow and my eyes firmly shut. The sharp, aggressive clicking of expensive designer heels announced the arrival of my daughter-in-law. Megan did not walk into the room with the quiet reverence usually reserved for the critically ill. She marched in with the absolute entitlement of a woman inspecting a piece of damaged property. She dropped her heavy leather handbag onto the visitor chair and immediately began complaining. She did not ask Aaron or Naomi if my condition had stabilized. She did not inquire if I was in any physical pain or if the doctors had provided a recovery timeline. Her very first concern was the exorbitant daily rate of the private hospital room. She hissed at Aaron that keeping me hooked up to these useless machines was draining thousands of dollars a day from their guaranteed inheritance. She paced aggressively around the foot of my bed, treating my comatose body like a financial liability that was actively ruining her carefully constructed timeline. She angrily reminded Aaron that her parents were expecting a massive cash wire by the end of the week to save their sprawling suburban estate from foreclosure. She demanded to know why the rural asylum transfer was delayed until tomorrow morning instead of happening tonight. She stated that every single hour I spent breathing in this expensive facility was another dollar stolen directly from her pockets. Aaron tried to calm her down with hushed, frantic whispers, promising her that the county paperwork was already finalized and legally binding. He assured his wife that the medical transport vehicle was officially booked for sunrise and that the delay was purely a hospital protocol issue. I laid there listening to this wealthy white woman openly calculate the exact monetary cost of my remaining heartbeats while my own son nodded along in desperate, pathetic agreement. Megan scoffed at Aaron's weak reassurances and crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She stepped directly beside my bed and leaned over my face. I could smell the overpowering scent of her expensive floral perfume mingling with the sharp antiseptic hospital air. She coldly informed Aaron that simply locking me in a rural asylum was no longer sufficient to solve their immediate financial crisis. She explicitly stated that they needed to expedite the $5 million life insurance payout to completely clear her family's massive debts before the bank seized their properties. She turned to my son and demanded that he leverage his newly established medical proxy to sign a do not resuscitate order immediately. She argued that given my supposedly severe cognitive decline and my sudden physical collapse, the hospital administration would perfectly understand their grim decision to withhold life-saving measures. She coldly calculated that if my heart happened to stop during the night, the medical staff would be legally bound to step back and let me die. Aaron hesitated for a fraction of a second. That infinitesimal pause was the very last shred of hope I held for my flesh and blood. My mind violently flashed back 35 years to a sunny afternoon in our old concrete driveway. I remembered running behind a tiny blue bicycle, holding the seat steady, while a 7-year-old Aaron pedaled furiously ahead of me. I remembered the sheer terror in his eyes when he lost his balance and scraped his knee on the rough pavement. I had scooped him up in my arms, wiped away his tears, and promised my little boy that I would always protect him from the dangers of the world. I had worked double shifts repairing heavy machinery just to ensure he never felt the crushing weight of poverty or the sting of racial inequality. I had sacrificed my own youth and my own dreams to build the impenetrable foundation of his future. Now that same boy was standing in a sterile hospital room holding a medical clipboard. I listened with absolute agonizing clarity as the sharp scratch of a ballpoint pen echoed through the quiet suite. Aaron signed his name on the legal document without uttering a single word of protest. He officially authorized the hospital staff to stand by and watch me die. He traded the life of his father for the temporary financial approval of a white woman who secretly despised his heritage. The ultimate betrayal was entirely complete. My heart turned into a solid block of ice. I no longer had a son to protect. I only had a target to destroy. The scratching of the pen ceased and a heavy silence settled over the room. Megan let out a deep, satisfied sigh and praised Aaron for making the tough but necessary choice for the future of their elite family. She reached into her handbag, grabbed her keys, and announced they should go grab an expensive dinner downtown to celebrate their impending wealth. I decided that their gruesome celebration was entirely premature. I took a slow, deep breath and let the heart monitor register a sudden, strong spike in my pulse. I opened my eyes. I did not blink in confusion or groan in artificial pain. I sat up perfectly straight in the hospital bed and ripped the oxygen cannula out of my nostrils with a swift, fluid motion. The sudden, violent movement caused Naomi to shriek in pure, unadulterated terror. Aaron dropped the medical clipboard onto the linoleum floor with a loud, sharp clatter. Megan stumbled backward, knocking her heavy designer chair violently against the plastered wall. I looked directly at the three of them with sharp, lucid, and terrifyingly calm intelligence. I completely dropped the facade of the broken, dementia-ridden old man I had been playing for weeks. My voice was deep, resonant, and completely steady as I announced that I was feeling absolutely fantastic. I told them that the thick fog in my brain had miraculously cleared, and I had never felt more alive or more focused in my entire life. The utter horror painted across their pale faces was an absolute masterpiece of human panic. They stared at me as if a corpse had just reanimated to judge their gravest sins. I did not give them a single second to formulate a lie or scramble for a pathetic medical excuse. I looked directly at Aaron and ordered him to contact his prestigious country club immediately. I instructed him to book their largest private dining room for this upcoming Saturday night. I demanded that he invite his entire bankrupt-in-law family, his corporate business partners, and the local bank manager who processed his loans. I smiled a cold, dead smile and informed them that my miraculous medical recovery had inspired me to officially update my last will and testament. I told them I wanted to gather the entire elite community together so I could publicly announce the final distribution of my entire estate. I laid back against the hospital pillows, crossing my arms, and ordered them to leave my room immediately to start planning my grand celebration. What would you do if you woke up to hear your own family signing away your life? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. The heavy hospital door swung shut behind them, leaving me alone in the quiet suite. Despite the shock of my sudden awakening, my treacherous family quickly reconstructed their own narrative of victory in the hallway. I could hear their muffled voices vibrating through the thin drywall. Megan excitedly whispered to Aaron that my sudden burst of clarity was simply the final frantic surge of a dying brain. She eagerly convinced him that my brush with death had entirely broken my spirit and forced me to surrender my remaining assets directly to them. Naomi chimed in with absolute delight, proclaiming that my demand for a public dinner was the ultimate proof of my total submission. They genuinely believed I wanted to hand over my sprawling estate in a grand gesture of patriarchal pride before my mind deteriorated into nothingness. They walked back into my room an hour later wearing sickeningly sweet smiles and exuding total victory. Aaron proudly announced that he had already secured the elite diamond dining room at his prestigious country club for Saturday night. He patted my shoulder and told me how incredibly brave I was for finally letting go of the reins. Naomi packed my overnight bag with cheerful efficiency, humming a light tune as if she were preparing for a luxury vacation. They were absolutely thrilled by my supposed capitulation, entirely blind to the massive legal snare snapping shut around their ankles. Their arrogance was so profound they never once questioned why an allegedly demented man would suddenly request the presence of their most elite social circle. They saw only the glittering promise of $5 million and a sprawling real estate portfolio falling directly into their laps. I maintained my composed, stoic expression and allowed them to wheel me out of the hospital with the triumphant air of a conquering army. We arrived back at the sprawling suburban house, and Naomi immediately guided me to my leather recliner in the living room. She offered me a cup of hot tea, which I politely declined. I requested a notepad and a pen, stating that I needed to finalize the exclusive guest list for my ultimate farewell dinner. Aaron and Megan sat eagerly on the sofa directly across from me, watching my every move like starving vultures. I slowly dictated the names with absolute and deliberate precision. I explicitly demanded the attendance of Megan's parents and her younger brother Bradley, the fraudulent notary. I told Megan that our two families needed to officially unite their legacies in front of the entire community. Megan beamed with pride and immediately texted her bankrupt parents, promising them a night of unprecedented celebration. Next, I insisted that Aaron invite the primary investors of his failing technology firm, along with Richard, the bank manager who had processed his fraudulent commercial loans. I explained that I wanted his professional colleagues to witness the official passing of my corporate torch into his capable hands. Aaron puffed out his chest with sheer arrogance and eagerly agreed to secure their attendance. Naomi was absolutely delighted by the extravagant roster. She desperately wanted a massive public spectacle to showcase her impending wealth and solidify her status among the city's highest social elite. She spent the entire afternoon ordering expensive floral centerpieces and coordinating a 5-course gourmet menu with the country club catering director. She strutted around the house, barking orders into her cell phone, completely intoxicated by the illusion of her ultimate triumph. I sat quietly in my chair, watching my wife arrange the exact audience that would soon witness her total destruction. I played the role of the tired, generous patriarch, perfectly offering gentle suggestions regarding the wine selection and the seating chart. I specifically requested that Megan's parents be seated directly adjacent to the main presentation screen in the private dining room. I wanted them to have a flawless, unobstructed view of their own financial annihilation. They eagerly accepted every single one of my requests, entirely convinced that they were orchestrating the finest night of their wealthy lives. The house finally grew quiet on Thursday evening after Naomi exhausted herself with the elaborate party preparations. I locked myself inside the guest bedroom and booted up my encrypted laptop. A secure video call from Jonathan connected immediately on the screen. My ruthless federal attorney sat behind his marble desk looking incredibly satisfied. He confirmed that the trap was now completely inescapable. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially finalized the arrest warrants for wire fraud, forgery, and felony conspiracy to commit murder. The Internal Revenue Service had officially secured the seizure warrants for Megan's parents' estate and Aaron's corporate shell accounts. Jonathan informed me that the federal agents were already coordinating with local tactical units to quietly surround the country club on Saturday night. The net was woven flawlessly, leaving absolutely no avenue for legal escape or financial evasion. I thanked Jonathan for his meticulous execution and closed the laptop. I walked over to the closet and pulled out a heavy, reinforced leather briefcase. I began packing the instruments of my final vengeance with cold, surgical precision. I placed the high-definition surveillance photographs of Aaron poisoning my coffee into a thick manila folder. I added the certified toxicology reports, the forged commercial loan documents, and the fraudulent psychiatric evaluations. I carefully slipped the digital drive containing the audio recordings of their midnight conspiracies into a secure, waterproof pocket. Every single piece of irrefutable evidence was neatly organized and ready for public display. I snapped the brass locks of the briefcase shut with a heavy, definitive click. I looked at my reflection in the mirror hanging on the guest room wall. I did not see a victim or a frail old man waiting to die. I saw a 70-year-old engineer who had systematically dismantled a criminal syndicate operating inside his own home. I placed the briefcase near the door and laid down on the bed. I was ready to walk into the elite country club and burn their false aristocratic empire to the ground in front of their most esteemed peers. The heavy crystal chandeliers of the diamond dining room cast a brilliant golden glow over the long, polished mahogany table. Saturday night at the elite country club was a spectacle of absolute manufactured wealth. Naomi had spared no expense using what she believed to be my unlimited credit lines to decorate the private hall with towering floral centerpieces and imported silk napkins. The room was packed with the exact audience I had requested. Aaron's corporate investors mingled near the private bar, laughing loudly. Richard, the bank manager, stood nervously near the entryway, sipping an expensive scotch. I sat quietly at the head of the table, observing the gathering storm. Megan's parents approached my chair with the overwhelming arrogance of people who believed they owned the very floor I walked on. Her father wore a tailored tuxedo, and her mother draped herself in diamonds that were secretly facing bank foreclosure. They offered me hands that had never worked a day of hard labor in their lives. Megan's father patted my shoulder with thinly veiled racial condescension. He adopted the slow, overly articulated tone one might use to address a dim-witted servant. He thanked me profusely for my highly generous financial contributions to their esteemed family legacy. He smiled a predatory smile and stated that my lifelong hard work was finally serving a greater aristocratic purpose. Her mother chimed in, expressing fake sympathy for my supposed cognitive struggles while subtly adjusting her stolen jewelry. They treated me exactly like an old African-American workhorse that was successfully being sent to the financial slaughterhouse for their direct benefit. I looked directly into their arrogant eyes and offered a polite, vacant smile. I nodded slowly, playing the role of the docile, defeated patriarch, yielding his entire estate to his social superiors. They turned their backs to me, completely satisfied with their absolute dominance. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and watched the vultures circle the table, entirely oblivious to the federal snipers currently positioning themselves in the parking lot outside. The 5-course gourmet meal progressed with the sickening theatricality of a royal coronation. Waiters in crisp white uniforms poured vintage champagne into crystal flutes, while the guests feasted on prime cuts of beef and imported seafood. Naomi sat to my right, radiating pure, triumphant greed. She occasionally patted my hand to maintain her public facade as the devoted, tragic wife watching her husband fade away. I remained absolutely silent, sipping my sparkling water and carefully tracking the movement of every single person in the room. As the dessert plates were cleared, Aaron stood up from his chair and tapped his silver spoon against his champagne glass. The sharp ringing commanded the attention of the entire room. My son adjusted his expensive silk tie and looked down the length of the table with a perfectly rehearsed expression of noble sorrow. He began to deliver a sickeningly sweet speech about family loyalty and the heavy burden of generational legacy. He spoke eloquently about my decades of grueling engineering work, framing my lifetime of sacrifice as a noble foundation built exclusively for his current corporate success. He looked directly at his wealthy investors and promised them that my vast financial resources were now safely secured under his capable modern management. He turned to Megan's bankrupt parents and praised their aristocratic guidance, declaring that our two families were now officially merged into an unstoppable financial dynasty. Aaron raised his glass and delivered a masterful lie about how deeply he loved his father and how he was honoring my wishes by officially taking over the legal and financial reins of the estate tonight. The audience erupted into polite, enthusiastic applause. Megan wiped a highly dramatic fake tear from her cheek. Bradley, the fraudulent notary, raised his glass in a mocking salute. Richard, the bank manager, nodded vigorously, completely relieved that the illegal commercial loans were supposedly being legitimized in front of witnesses. I sat perfectly still at the head of the table, letting the absolute maximum amount of arrogant oxygen inflate their oversized egos. I wanted them to feel entirely invincible. I needed them to stand at the absolute peak of their fake mountain before I pushed them off the financial cliff. They were intoxicated by the sheer power of their successful conspiracy. They believed the transfer of wealth was a finalized reality. Aaron smiled down at me, waiting for the confused old man to officially hand over the crown. I placed my water glass gently onto the mahogany table. The room grew quiet in anticipation of my final surrender. Aaron finished his grand toast and extended his hand toward my chair. He gestured for me to stand up and address the elite crowd, assuming I would deliver a pathetic, rambling speech of total resignation. He offered a condescending smile and gently encouraged me to share my final wishes with our esteemed guests. I placed my hands flat against the polished mahogany and pushed myself up from the heavy chair. I moved with agonizing slowness, deliberately maintaining the frail illusion for a few seconds longer. The room fell into an absolute hushed silence. Every eye locked onto my every movement, waiting for the broken patriarch to formally pass his fortune into the hands of the thieves. I did not reach for the microphone. I did not offer a single word of gratitude or surrender. Instead, I turned my back to the crowded table and walked with sudden, steady purpose directly toward the main entrance of the private dining room. I bypassed Aaron completely, leaving him standing awkwardly with his hand extended in the air. I reached the massive mahogany double doors leading out to the main country club lobby. I grabbed the heavy brass handles and firmly pulled the doors shut. I reached up and engaged the heavy deadbolts. The sharp mechanical clack of the locks securing into place echoed loudly across the silent room, sealing everyone inside. A sudden wave of confusion rippled through the seated guests. Naomi half stood from her chair, nervously asking what I was doing. I did not answer my treacherous wife. I turned around and faced the captive audience. My posture was no longer stooped. The manufactured tremors in my hands vanished entirely. I stood tall, radiating the cold, imposing authority of a man fully in command of a hostile environment. I looked past the panicked faces of my family and stared directly into the dark, shadowed alcove at the very back of the private hall. I gave a single sharp nod. The heavy velvet curtains shifted. Jonathan stepped out of the shadows and walked into the bright light of the chandelier, carrying my reinforced leather briefcase. The ruthless federal attorney took his position firmly at my right side. The grand celebration was officially over, and the execution was about to begin. Jonathan walked forward with measured, predatory steps and placed the heavy, reinforced leather briefcase directly onto the polished mahogany table. The sharp, metallic click of the brass locks snapping open echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I did not raise a glass to return my son's pathetic, hypocritical toast. I reached deep into the briefcase and pulled out 3 thick manila envelopes. I lifted them high into the air for the entire room to see before slamming them down onto the center of the table with tremendous, punishing force. The heavy thud made the crystal champagne flutes rattle violently, spilling expensive wine onto the imported silk tablecloth. I looked directly at my daughter-in-law, who was still frozen in her chair, gripping her napkin with white knuckles. I raised my voice, ensuring every single elite guest and corporate investor in the room could hear me perfectly. I loudly thanked Megan for the incredibly generous $5 million life insurance policy she had secretly taken out on my life just 2 weeks ago. The color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost, confronting her own nightmare. I did not stop there. I turned my gaze toward the fraudulent notary Bradley and thanked him for his outstanding criminal efficiency in rubber-stamping forged documents. I then announced to the entire country club gathering that my loving family had also gone to the tremendous trouble of purchasing a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. I explained with crystal clarity that the document resting in the first envelope legally declared me profoundly incompetent due to severe dementia. I stated that this fake medical diagnosis was the exact weapon they intended to use to permanently lock me inside a state asylum by tomorrow morning. The guests began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, murmuring in shocked disbelief. Aaron opened his mouth to speak, but the sheer shock of my lucid, articulate delivery completely paralyzed his vocal cords. He stared at the manila envelopes as if they were live explosives primed to detonate. I told the room that my family had orchestrated a flawless plan to steal my entire retirement portfolio while keeping their own hands perfectly clean. Jonathan did not wait for the initial shock to subside. My ruthless attorney stepped over to the audiovisual control panel built into the dining room wall. He bypassed the country club system and plugged his encrypted tablet directly into the overhead projector. The massive presentation screen behind Megan's parents suddenly hummed to life, casting a harsh, bright light over their terrified faces. The first image flashed onto the screen in high definition. It was the official toxicology report from the private laboratory. I pointed at the glaring red chemical breakdown and explained exactly what they were looking at. I detailed how my devoted wife Naomi had been systematically replacing my daily blood pressure medication with high-grade black market sedatives explicitly designed to chemically destroy my central nervous system. I watched Naomi physically recoil in her chair, gripping the mahogany table with shaking hands as her ultimate betrayal was broadcast to the elite crowd. Jonathan swiped the tablet screen with calculated precision. The next slide displayed the forensic breakdown of the artisanal coffee Aaron had brewed for me just last weekend. I explained to Aaron's horrified business investors that my son had personally laced my morning beverage with a synthetic neurotoxin to artificially accelerate my mental collapse. The investors physically pushed their chairs away from Aaron, treating him like a highly contagious disease. The room began to erupt in absolute disgust, but Jonathan quickly silenced them by triggering the next piece of federal evidence. The crisp, unmistakable sound of the hidden camera audio recording suddenly blared through the dining room's surround sound speakers. Megan's cold, ambitious voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers, piercing the heavy air. Everyone in the room listened in abject horror as the recording captured Megan explicitly demanding that Aaron hurry up and force me to sign over the coastal vacation property. Her recorded voice viciously stated that once they secured the real estate, they would dump me into a rural asylum and trigger the massive life insurance payout. She called me a worthless old burden on the tape, proving her utter contempt for the African-American man who was unknowingly financing her entire existence. The audio quality was pristine, leaving absolutely no room for denial or misinterpretation. Aaron's corporate partners stared at him with profound revulsion, realizing they had trusted their capital to a man capable of murdering his own father. The elite investors realized they were currently breaking bread with a highly coordinated criminal syndicate. The digital evidence completely dismantled every single lie my family had carefully constructed over the past month. I watched the projected light reflect off the horrified faces of the country club guests as the aristocratic illusion Megan and Aaron had built burned to the ground right before their very eyes. The audio recording clicked off and the room descended into a stunned, horrifying silence. The only sound in the massive dining hall was the frantic, ragged breathing of the exposed conspirators. Richard, the bank manager, pulled a linen handkerchief from his suit pocket and began aggressively wiping the sweat from his forehead. Megan's parents turned a sickening shade of pale. They shrank back into their expensive chairs, looking desperately toward the locked double doors, hoping for an escape route that did not exist. They finally realized that their luxurious lifestyle had been completely funded by an attempted murder plot, and they were now trapped inside a locked room with the surviving victim. They stared at their daughter as if she were a total stranger, a monster they had unknowingly unleashed upon society. Naomi desperately tried to salvage the catastrophic situation. She let out a high-pitched, hysterical laugh that echoed awkwardly across the silent room. She stood up trembling violently and tried to address the crowd with frantic hand gestures. She stammered that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding or perhaps a sick practical joke played by a confused old man. She reached out toward me, forcing a pathetic, loving smile, claiming that my medication must be causing severe hallucinations and paranoia. I did not let her finish her pathetic, theatrical performance. I raised my hand and slammed my fist down onto the solid mahogany table with earth-shattering force. The heavy crystal glasses shook, and several porcelain plates rattled loudly against the wood. I leaned forward and demanded absolute total silence from everyone in the room. The sheer commanding authority in my voice instantly extinguished Naomi's hysterical laughter. She collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with her trembling hands as reality finally crushed her denial. I looked down the length of the table at the people who had tried to erase my existence. I told them that the time for lies, gaslighting, and fake medical diagnoses was officially over. I stated that I had endured their toxic dinners and their lethal coffee for weeks, simply to gather the exact evidence needed to destroy them entirely. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense. The elite guests held their breath, entirely captivated and horrified by the absolute destruction of a prominent family. The predators who had planned to feast on my carcass were now firmly pinned under my heel. I had them exactly where I wanted them, and the true execution had only just begun. Megan's chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor as she shot to her feet. The polished veneer of the aristocratic heiress instantly shattered, leaving behind a desperate, panicked woman cornered by her own hubris. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me and began to scream at the top of her lungs. She desperately appealed to the country club guests and the wealthy corporate investors sitting frozen around the mahogany table. She insisted that I was suffering from a severe and highly aggressive dementia episode. She shrilly proclaimed that the documents projected on the wall were the paranoid delusions manufactured by a sick, deteriorating mind. She demanded that someone immediately call the country club security to physically remove me from the private dining room for my own safety. She acted deeply offended that her pristine family was being subjected to the wild hallucinations of an unstable old man. She looked toward Aaron, expecting him to back up her frantic narrative, but Aaron remained entirely paralyzed in his seat, staring at the projector screen as if it were a loaded weapon. Megan's voice reached a hysterical pitch as she grabbed a crystal water glass and threatened to throw it if nobody intervened to stop my supposed medical episode. She begged her elite peers not to listen to a single word I said, relying on her lifetime of white privilege to automatically discredit my factual evidence. She firmly believed that her country club status would shield her from the undeniable truth illuminating the dark room. I did not move a single muscle to stop her pathetic theatrical outburst. I stood tall at the head of the table, letting her scream until her voice cracked and her throat went raw. The wealthy guests looked at her with absolute disgust, realizing that her hysterical denials were merely the frantic death throes of an exposed criminal. I raised my hand with absolute authority and commanded Jonathan to advance the presentation to the next slide. My ruthless attorney tapped the tablet screen with calculated precision. The audio recording vanished and was instantly replaced by a series of high-definition banking statements. The massive screen illuminated the room with glaring red numbers detailing the catastrophic debts belonging exclusively to Megan's parents. I turned my gaze directly toward the aristocratic couple who had treated me like a dim-witted servant just an hour ago. I loudly narrated the exact timeline of their financial ruin to the entire room. I explained that their sprawling colonial estate, their luxury imported vehicles, and their exclusive country club memberships were completely leveraged to the brink of total foreclosure. The room gasped as Jonathan advanced the slides to display the precise wire transfers originating from my stolen retirement portfolios. I traced the path of the stolen funds as they flowed from Aaron's fraudulent commercial loan directly into the offshore shell accounts controlled by Megan's father. I systematically dismantled their entire facade of generational wealth and inherent white superiority. I exposed them not as titans of industry, but as common desperate thieves surviving entirely on the stolen labor of an elderly African-American engineer. I reminded the elite audience that I spent 40 years working brutal double shifts in an aerospace plant, sweating and sacrificing to build a legitimate fortune. Meanwhile, the so-called elite family sitting across the table could not even pay their own mortgage without robbing a black man blind. I watched the mother clutch her diamond necklace in sheer horror as I explicitly stated that the jewelry she was currently wearing was purchased with my stolen pension money. I stripped away every single ounce of their unearned dignity, leaving them completely naked and exposed in front of their most esteemed peers. The corporate investors shook their heads in profound disgust, realizing the entire aristocratic legacy Megan constantly bragged about was nothing more than a pathetic, bankrupt delusion. Megan dropped back into her chair, utterly defeated as the undeniable mathematical proof of her family's parasitic existence burned brightly on the projection screen. The suffocating tension inside the locked dining room reached an absolute boiling point. The devastating reality of the federal evidence triggered a primal fight-or-flight response among the conspirators. Richard, the bank manager, realized the walls were closing in rapidly. He understood that the fraudulent commercial loan documents displayed on the screen contained his direct administrative authorization. He slowly pushed his heavy chair back from the table, attempting to remain entirely unnoticed amidst the chaos of Megan's ruined family. He grabbed his suit jacket and began to edge quietly toward the rear service exit located near the catering station. He desperately hoped to slip out the back door and flee the premises before the authorities arrived. His cowardly escape plan failed instantly. Jonathan anticipated the exact maneuver. My federal attorney stepped away from the audiovisual controls and moved with terrifying speed to block the rear exit. Jonathan stood firmly in front of the heavy wooden door, crossing his arms and fixing the bank manager with a lethal, predatory stare. Jonathan loudly announced to the entire room that Richard was heavily implicated in the federal wire fraud conspiracy. My attorney explained that Richard deliberately bypassed mandatory security protocols and actively authorized the forged collateral loans in exchange for a massive kickback from Aaron. He explicitly stated that the bank manager facilitated the theft of my retirement funds and was currently facing multiple federal indictments for banking fraud and criminal conspiracy. Richard turned a sickly shade of gray and stumbled backward, colliding violently with a serving cart. The expensive porcelain plates crashed to the floor, shattering into hundreds of jagged pieces. The loud crash shattered the final remaining shred of decorum in the room. Absolute panic erupted among the guilty parties. Bradley, the fraudulent notary, began hyperventilating and clutching his chest while Megan's parents desperately tried to dial their defense attorneys on their cell phones. Aaron buried his face in his hands, sobbing loudly as his entire corporate and personal world disintegrated simultaneously. The elegant country club dining room transformed into a chaotic prison holding a terrified syndicate of exposed criminals. Aaron pushed his heavy mahogany chair back with such sudden violence that it crashed backward onto the polished hardwood floor. He scrambled frantically over the fallen porcelain plates and shattered crystal, his face twisted into an unrecognizable mask of raw, unhinged fury. The carefully manicured facade of a successful technology executive instantly vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate cornered predator lashing out at his only remaining target. He charged blindly toward the head of the table where I stood. He screamed at the absolute top of his lungs that the money was his by blood and birthright. He shouted that I owed him my entire life savings simply because I had brought him into this world. He demanded that I stop this ridiculous charade and sign over the asset portfolios, immediately threatening severe physical violence right in front of the horrified country club guests. He closed the distance between us and aggressively grabbed the lapels of my tailored suit jacket. His spit flew onto my face as he yelled that he deserved every single penny of my retirement funds to build his own modern corporate legacy. He claimed my life was already over and that my refusal to surrender my wealth was a selfish crime against his future. I did not flinch or step backward. I did not raise my hands to defend myself against his pathetic assault. I simply looked deep into the eyes of the boy I had once taught to ride a bicycle and saw absolutely nothing but a hollow, greedy stranger. The wealthy corporate investors watched in sheer terror as the supposedly refined businessman reduced himself to a violent, raving thug, demanding his unearned inheritance. His explosive public meltdown proved every single point I had just made on the projector screen. He felt entirely entitled to murder his own father simply to fund a lavish suburban lifestyle that he could not afford. His arrogance blinded him to the undeniable reality that his terrifying tantrum was the final act of a deeply doomed man. Before Aaron could pull back his clenched fist to strike my face, the heavy mahogany double doors on the eastern wall of the private dining room burst open with explosive kinetic force. A highly coordinated tactical team of heavily armed federal agents stormed into the opulent hall wearing dark ballistic vests emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI. The sharp, commanding shouts of federal law enforcement professionals instantly neutralized the chaotic dining room. Agents moved with terrifying military speed, securing all the main exits and establishing a strict tactical perimeter around the shattered dinner table. Two large agents grabbed Aaron by the shoulders, violently tearing his hands away from my suit jacket. They slammed him face first onto the polished wooden table, rattling the remaining silver cutlery and sending wine glasses tumbling to the floor. Aaron screamed in pure shock as cold steel handcuffs snapped brutally around his wrists, pinning his arms behind his back. Jonathan stepped forward into the center of the room, commanding absolute legal authority. He held a thick stack of official federal arrest warrants bearing the heavy blue seal of a federal judge. My attorney did not mince his words or lower his voice. He read the devastating indictments in a booming, resonant tone that echoed harshly off the high vaulted ceilings. He looked directly down at Aaron and explicitly detailed the severe federal charges my son was now facing. He listed multiple counts of interstate wire fraud stemming directly from the unauthorized commercial loans and the stolen retirement funds. He announced the felony forgery charges linked to the falsified medical documents and the fake power of attorney paperwork. He detailed the severe sentencing enhancements for egregious elder financial abuse. Then Jonathan delivered the ultimate killing blow to their entire operation. He read the federal indictment for conspiracy to commit premeditated murder by poisoning. He cited the lethal synthetic neurotoxins mixed into my artisanal coffee, clearly stating that they had actively attempted to execute an elderly man solely to trigger a massive $5 million insurance payout. The elite guests gasped in pure, unadulterated horror, shrinking away from the table as the true depravity of the criminal syndicate was laid entirely bare. Aaron thrashed against the heavy hands of the federal agents, sobbing wildly and begging for his mother to intervene. Naomi remained completely frozen in her chair, entirely paralyzed by the terrifying sight of her golden child being restrained like a violent street criminal. The elegant room was suddenly illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of federal transport vehicles, reflecting sharply off the country club windows outside. Megan watched her husband get forcefully pinned to the mahogany table and completely lost her final remaining grip on reality. She frantically scanned the heavily guarded room, searching desperately for an escape route that absolutely did not exist. Her terrified, wide eyes locked onto her younger brother Bradley, who was currently cowering near the catering station, trembling like a frightened child. She screamed for him to call their powerful family lawyers immediately and demand an aggressive diplomatic intervention. She shrieked that her elite family connections would completely obliterate these ridiculous charges and have the federal agents fired from their jobs by tomorrow morning. She demanded that Bradley use his notary contacts to stop the arrests, insisting that the entire raid was a massive illegal misunderstanding. The lead FBI agent stepped directly in front of her, shutting down her hysterical, arrogant demands with chilling, absolute professionalism. The agent calmly informed Megan that she was completely wasting her breath and making the situation significantly worse for herself. He stated explicitly that Bradley could not make any phone calls to any high-priced defense attorneys because he was currently in federal custody. The agent revealed that an entirely separate tactical unit had raided Bradley's boutique real estate firm exactly 1 hour prior to this dinner. He was arrested on site for his direct involvement in rubber stamping the forged real estate transfers and officially utilizing his state notary seal to facilitate massive interstate felony fraud. Bradley stood near the dessert cart, shaking uncontrollably as a second pair of agents approached him and secured his wrists in cold steel cuffs. He did not even attempt to fight back as they read him his Miranda rights in front of the stunned country club elite. The inescapable reality of their catastrophic situation crashed down onto Megan like a collapsing concrete ceiling. Her golden boy brother was going to federal prison. Her husband was facing a capital murder charge. Her aristocratic parents were completely bankrupt and actively being investigated by the Internal Revenue Service for receiving stolen property. The elite untouchable bubble she had ruthlessly maintained at my total expense had instantly burst, leaving her completely and utterly defenseless against the brutal weight of the federal justice system. The horrific truth of spending decades locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary finally registered in her wide, panicked eyes. She collapsed heavily onto her knees, clutching her expensive designer dress and wailing in pure, unfiltered agony. The glorious social event she had spent weeks meticulously planning had successfully transformed into the exact, unyielding mechanism of her permanent destruction. I remained standing tall at the head of the table, adjusting my suit jacket, and watching the federal authorities systematically dismantle the arrogant predators who had so confidently plotted to end my life. The reality of the federal raid finally shattered the last remaining fragment of my wife's composure. Naomi watched the FBI agents physically restrain our son against the mahogany table, and her meticulously crafted aristocratic facade disintegrated into pure animal panic. She realized with absolute clarity that the impenetrable legal shield she thought she possessed did not exist. She was not the untouchable matriarch of a wealthy dynasty. She was a co-conspirator in a federal murder plot, and her turn was rapidly approaching. Naomi collapsed heavily onto the polished hardwood floor. Her expensive silk dress pooled around her as she crawled desperately toward the head of the table. She reached out with trembling hands and violently grabbed my pant legs. She buried her face against my knees and began to sob with loud theatrical gasps. Her tears soaked through the fabric of my trousers as she desperately pleaded for my mercy. She wailed that she was incredibly sorry for everything that had transpired over the past month. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes and attempted to execute her final manipulation. She aggressively pointed her finger at Aaron and Megan, explicitly blaming them for the entire criminal enterprise. She shrieked that she had been completely brainwashed by our greedy son and intimidated by her wealthy, white daughter-in-law. She claimed she never actually wanted to slip the black market sedatives into my pill organizer or sign the fraudulent medical evaluations. She swore to me under the bright chandelier lights that she was merely a helpless victim trapped in their wicked financial scheme. She begged me to remember our 40 years of marriage, the vows we took, and the home we built together. She pleaded with me to call off Jonathan and the federal agents, promising that she would spend the rest of her life making it up to me. Her performance was a sickening display of absolute cowardice. She was perfectly willing to throw her own son into a federal prison just to save her own skin from the impending legal slaughter. I looked down at the woman I had slept beside for 4 decades. I searched my heart for a single ounce of pity, a shred of lingering affection, or even a spark of residual anger. I found absolutely nothing. My emotional reservoir regarding Naomi was completely empty, drained dry by the toxic coffee and the forged psychiatric evaluations she had eagerly endorsed. I did not bend down to help her up. I did not offer a comforting word or a hand of forgiveness. I simply took a firm, deliberate step backward, physically tearing my legs away from her desperate grasp. Naomi slumped forward onto the hardwood floor, her hands grasping at the empty air where I had just stood. I looked at her with a gaze entirely devoid of emotion. I spoke with a voice as cold and sharp as cracked ice. I informed her that the 40 years of marriage she was currently weaponizing to save herself died the exact second she placed those illegal sedatives into my morning routine. I told her that she did not act out of fear or manipulation. She acted out of pure, unadulterated greed, and I had the high-definition video recordings to prove her enthusiastic participation. I did not stop at breaking her heart. I systematically destroyed her sanctuary. I calmly announced that the sprawling suburban estate she was so desperate to return to no longer belonged to us. I explained that Jonathan had executed a flawless legal transfer 48 hours ago. Our primary residence, along with all the luxury furnishings she cherished, had been permanently deeded to a charitable foundation supporting elderly victims of domestic abuse. I watched her eyes widen in sheer horror as the gravity of my words registered in her panicked mind. I told her that the charity organization was scheduled to take official physical possession of the property tomorrow morning. I laid out her final ultimatum with surgical precision. I gave her exactly 12 hours to return to the house, pack a single suitcase of basic clothing, and vacate the premises forever. I explicitly warned her that if I found her on the property after the sun came up tomorrow, I would hand Jonathan the specific video files proving her direct involvement in the coffee poisoning. I would ensure the federal prosecutor charged her as an active accomplice to attempted murder, guaranteeing she would die inside a concrete cell. I gave her a stark choice between absolute poverty and a life sentence. The brutal finality of my eviction notice crushed the last breath of resistance out of Naomi. She remained crumpled on the dining room floor, a weeping shadow of the arrogant woman who had walked into the country club just 2 hours ago. The federal agents did not pause their operations to accommodate her emotional breakdown. The lead tactical officer signaled his team to finalize the apprehensions. The sharp, heavy clinking of solid steel handcuffs ratcheting securely around wrists echoed sharply through the grand room. It was a harsh metallic rhythm that contrasted violently with the soft, elegant classical music still playing faintly through the country club hallway speakers outside the private doors. Aaron was hauled violently to his feet, his expensive Italian suit wrinkled and stained with spilled wine. He did not look at me as the agents marched him toward the exit. His spirit was entirely broken by the sheer magnitude of the federal indictments. Megan fought against the restraint, screaming obscenities at the agents and threatening lawsuits that would never materialize. She was dragged away kicking and sobbing, her fake aristocratic legacy completely annihilated by the undeniable digital evidence of her crimes. Bradley, the fraudulent notary, followed them with his head bowed in absolute defeat. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, flanked by Jonathan, and watched the systematic eradication of my treacherous family. I did not utter another word. I maintained an absolute calculated silence as the federal authorities cleared the room of the predators who had plotted to end my life. The immense wealth they had tried to steal remained perfectly secure in my untouchable trusts. The elite guests and corporate investors who had witnessed the entire spectacle began to quietly file out the back doors, avoiding my gaze entirely. They had arrived expecting to watch an old black man surrender his fortune to his wealthy white in-laws. Instead, they witnessed a masterclass in relentless execution. The private dining room was soon completely empty, save for me, Jonathan, and the shattered porcelain on the floor. The air felt incredibly light. The The suffocating weight of their deception was gone forever. I adjusted my suit jacket and prepared to walk out into my new life, leaving the ruins of their empire entirely behind me. Jonathan gestured toward the main double doors of the private dining room, signaling the tactical team to execute the extraction. The federal agents flanked my son and my daughter-in-law, gripping their upper arms with uncompromising physical force. They marched Aaron and Megan out of the shattered wreckage of their coronation dinner and directly into the grand main lobby of the country club. The timing was an absolute masterpiece of public humiliation. The lobby was currently packed with the highest echelons of the city elite mingling over post-dinner cocktails and expensive cigars. The soft jazz piano music playing in the atrium was instantly drowned out by the harsh, authoritative commands of the federal agents clearing a path through the wealthy crowd. Every single conversation in the massive room stopped dead. Hundreds of judgmental eyes turned simultaneously to witness the shocking spectacle. Aaron stumbled forward, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the polished marble floors. He kept his chin tucked firmly against his chest, desperately trying to hide his face from the intense scrutiny of the corporate executives he had spent years trying to impress. The men who had previously toasted to his brilliant technological future now stared at him with profound, unadulterated disgust. They instinctively pulled their wives closer, stepping back to avoid any proximity to the disgraced criminal being hauled away in steel cuffs. Megan fared significantly worse under the blinding spotlight of public ruin. The very socialites she had desperately sought to dominate now looked at her as if she were a diseased animal. The whispered gossip rippled through the lobby like a shockwave, explicitly detailing how the so-called aristocratic heiress was actually a common fraudster, arrested for elder abuse and attempted murder. Megan wept openly, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, ruining her flawless, expensive makeup. She pleaded wildly with the silent crowd, begging anyone to call a lawyer or vouch for her character. Not a single person stepped forward. Her elite peers simply clutched their crystal champagne flutes and watched her complete social and legal annihilation in absolute silence. Their silent judgment was the ultimate punishment for a woman who valued her public image above human life. The federal procession pushed through the heavy brass and glass front doors of the country club and emerged into the cool, crisp night air of the sprawling parking lot. The flashing red and blue strobe lights from a dozen federal transport vehicles illuminated the manicured landscaping with harsh, aggressive flashes. I followed closely behind Jonathan, walking with the calm, measured stride of a man entirely in control of his domain. The parking lot held a second devastating surprise for the remaining conspirators. A separate specialized unit of federal officers wearing dark windbreakers, stamped with the bright yellow letters of the Internal Revenue Service, stood waiting beside a sleek black transport van. As Megan's parents stumbled out of the country club attempting to flee the disastrous scene, the IRS agents immediately intercepted them. The lead financial investigator loudly informed the bankrupt aristocrats that they were officially under arrest for the willful receipt of stolen funds and massive tax evasion. The father tried to aggressively brush the agents away, sputtering pathetic threats about his supposedly powerful legal connections. The federal agents responded by slamming him roughly against the hood of his own unpaid luxury sedan and snapping heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. His wife shrieked in sheer terror as an agent confiscated her stolen diamond necklace right there in the parking lot, logging it into a plastic evidence bag. Across the pavement, Richard, the corrupted bank manager, was escorted out of the service exit by two armed FBI agents. He looked completely defeated, his tailored suit jacket draped awkwardly over his cuffed hands to hide his shame. He was loaded into the back of a heavily armored federal vehicle destined for a holding cell far away from his comfortable corner office. I stood on the pristine brick walkway of the country club and watched the fleet of federal vehicles roar to life. The engines revved loudly, and the convoy sped down the long, winding driveway, taking my treacherous family and their greedy accomplices straight into the unforgiving jaws of the federal justice system. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the cool night air. The suffocating weight of my 40-year illusion was permanently lifted from my shoulders. I straightened my posture, pulled my tailored coat tightly against the evening chill, and walked slowly toward my waiting truck. I held my head high, radiating the profound, absolute dignity of an African-American man who had successfully defended his life, his wealth, and his honor against a syndicate of ruthless predators. The drive back to my sprawling suburban home was entirely peaceful. The dark tree-lined streets offered a quiet, serene contrast to the explosive chaos I had just unleashed at the country club. I pulled my truck into the wide concrete driveway and turned off the ignition. The house was completely dark except for a single porch light burning steadily in the night. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped inside. The profound silence of the empty house greeted me like an old, trusted friend. Naomi was completely gone. She had wisely heeded my strict 12-hour ultimatum. The entryway closet was empty, and her favorite winter coats were missing. She had packed whatever meager belongings she could carry and fled into the night terrified of the federal murder charges hanging directly over her head. I walked slowly through the quiet living room, passing the exact spot on the hardwood floor where I had faked my severe neurological collapse just a few days ago. The air inside the house no longer felt toxic or heavy. It felt entirely cleansed. I made my way down the short hallway and stepped into Naomi's former home office. The faint smell of the fresh cream-colored primer still lingered in the enclosed space. The room was exactly as I had left it on that fateful Tuesday afternoon. I walked deliberately toward the desk and picked up the heavy wooden landscape painting that had started this entire war. I lifted the solid oak frame with steady, unshakable hands. I did not struggle or feign any weakness. I aligned the thick hanging wire with the heavy metal hook installed high on the wall. I let the painting drop perfectly into place, completely concealing the hidden spring-loaded drywall compartment forever. I stepped back and adjusted the frame, ensuring it was flawlessly leveled. I stared at the painted landscape for a long, silent moment. The secret drawer behind it was now completely empty, stripped of the fraudulent passports, the malicious psychiatric evaluations, and the lethal life insurance policies. The weapons they had forged to destroy me were locked safely inside a federal evidence vault. I reached out and turned off the office light, plunging the freshly painted room into total darkness. The closing of that door finalized the absolute termination of my past life. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of cold water. I was entirely alone, but I had never felt more secure. The battlefield was completely cleared, and the final silent adjustment was nearly complete. 6 months passed with the steady rhythm of a metronome. The biting cold of the Atlanta winter was replaced by the warm, salty breeze of the Atlantic coast. I sat in a heavy Adirondack chair on the sweeping wooden deck of my newly purchased secluded cabin. The property was hidden behind a dense grove of ancient pine trees, completely invisible from the main coastal highway. The rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves against the rocky shoreline provided a profound, absolute peace that I had not experienced in 4 decades. I was completely isolated from the toxic social climbing and the relentless financial demands that had defined my previous existence. There were no fake smiles to interpret and no hidden cameras to monitor in the dark. The sprawling suburban house where my family had plotted my medical execution was now officially operating as a fully funded safe haven for elderly victims of domestic abuse, just as I had planned. The wealth I had secured in the irrevocable trust was quietly working to protect vulnerable people who lacked the resources to fight back. I breathed in the fresh sea air and let the morning sun warm my face. I wore a simple cotton shirt and comfortable canvas trousers, entirely shedding the heavy tailored suits I used to wear to appease my son's arrogant sensibilities. My physical health was pristine. The fabricated tremors and the manufactured confusion I had forced myself to perform were entirely gone. My mind was sharp-focused and completely free from the suffocating anxiety of betrayal. I watched a pair of seagulls dive towards the blue water, reflecting on the incredible journey from a trapped victim to a liberated man. The silence around me was not empty. It was filled with the pure, undeniable satisfaction of a perfectly executed survival strategy. The sharp ringing of my secure satellite phone broke the tranquil morning silence. I picked up the device from the wooden side table and accepted the incoming call. Jonathan spoke with his usual clipped, ruthless efficiency, skipping standard greetings entirely. My federal attorney was calling to deliver the final definitive legal update on the syndicate that had attempted to destroy me. He informed me that the federal prosecutors had successfully leveraged the overwhelming mountain of digital and forensic evidence we had gathered. Facing the absolute certainty of a lengthy public trial and decades of consecutive sentences, Aaron and Megan completely folded. Jonathan reported that my son and my former daughter-in-law had officially accepted brutal federal plea deals exactly 48 hours ago. They both pled guilty to multiple counts of interstate wire fraud, aggravated elder abuse, and felony conspiracy to commit murder. The federal judge showed absolutely zero leniency for their aristocratic pretensions. They were formally sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The elite corporate empire Aaron had desperately tried to build using my stolen blood and sweat was reduced to a miserable prison cell. Jonathan continued with his meticulous briefing, shifting his focus to the collateral damage. Megan's parents, who had eagerly feasted on my stolen retirement funds, were thoroughly decimated by the Internal Revenue Service. They were forced to declare complete and total bankruptcy. Their sprawling colonial estate was seized and liquidated at a federal auction, leaving them entirely destitute and publicly disgraced among their high society peers. Finally, Jonathan delivered the update regarding my former wife. Naomi had managed to evade direct federal conspiracy charges by fully cooperating with the authorities and turning state's evidence against her own son. However, her legal survival came at a catastrophic personal cost. She was currently living in a cramped government-subsidized studio apartment on the neglected outskirts of the city. Jonathan revealed that she was working grueling night shifts at a 24-hour laundromat just to afford her basic groceries. The woman who had plotted to erase my mind for a $5 million payout was now spending her twilight years folding other people's dirty clothes for minimum wage. The absolute justice of their respective downfalls was mathematically perfect. Every single person who had participated in the plot to institutionalize me was now permanently locked inside their own customized prison. Jonathan paused for a brief moment, allowing the sheer magnitude of their destruction to settle over the secure line. My ruthless attorney then asked me a final procedural question. He inquired if I wished to send any official communication to Aaron or Megan through their public defenders before they were transported to the federal facility. He also asked if I wanted to authorize a minimal monthly allowance from my charitable trust to keep Naomi from starving in her subsidized apartment. I looked out over the vast expanse of the blue ocean and listened to the steady crashing of the waves. I did not feel a single microscopic drop of pity or familial obligation. I spoke into the receiver with a voice as calm and unyielding as the rocky shoreline below my deck. I explicitly instructed Jonathan to permanently close their files and shred their contact information. I firmly declined to provide even a single penny of legal aid or basic financial support. I told my attorney that my charity was reserved exclusively for innocent victims, not convicted predators. I thanked Jonathan for his flawless execution of my defense and officially terminated his retainer. I pressed the red button on the phone and set the device face down on the wooden table, severing my final tie to the past. I walked into the bright, modern kitchen of my cabin and poured myself a tall glass of iced tea, letting the condensation cool my fingertips. I returned to the wooden deck and sat back down in the heavy Adirondack chair. The late afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the coastal horizon in brilliant shades of orange and deep purple. I took a slow, refreshing sip of the sweet tea and watched the sunset with absolute clarity. I felt absolutely no regret for the devastating actions I had taken. I had simply defended my life, my sanity, and my hard-earned legacy against a group of thieves who shared my last name. I had refused to become a silent casualty in their greedy narrative. The war was officially over, and the battlefield was completely washed clean. The silent adjustment was now fully complete. True power lies in absolute patience and careful observation. When confronted with unimaginable betrayal by those you trust, the most immediate anger only reveals your hand to the enemy. By maintaining a quiet facade, you allow greedy predators to expose their true nature and freely hand you the exact weapons needed for their ultimate destruction. Silence is never a sign of weakness. It is the most formidable strategy for securing your survival and ensuring absolute justice against toxic relatives. If this story resonated with your own life experiences, please share your thoughts below, like this video, and subscribe for more.